The ocean covers 71% of our planet. We've explored less than 5% of it. In those vast waters, ships disappear. Not just sink, disappear. Completely. Dinner still warm on the table, engines still running, no crew, no bodies, no explanation. Scientists have theories. Pirates, storms, accidents, mutiny. But the evidence doesn't match. Personal belongings untouched. Lifeboats still aboard. No signs of struggle. For the next 3 hours, we'll investigate 21 cases that have baffled maritime experts, coastguards, and investigators around the world. Ships that became legends, mysteries that remain unsolved. The High Aim 6, 2002. Picture this. You're a rescue worker standing on the deck of an Australian patrol boat, scanning the endless blue waters off the coast of Western Australia. It's January 8th, 2003, and what you're looking at shouldn't exist. There, floating calmly in the middle of nowhere, is a 20-metre fishing vessel with its engine purring quietly. The boat looks perfectly normal from a distance. Too normal. But as you get closer, something feels wrong. Very wrong. The High Aim 6 sits there like a floating puzzle bobbing gently in the waves about 80 nautical miles east of Rowley Shoals. When the Australian authorities first spotted this Taiwanese fishing boat 5 days earlier, it was moving under its own power, cutting through the water with purpose. Now, as they prepare to board it, the engine has gone silent, but everything else appears untouched. The boarding team climbs aboard, expecting to find fishermen dealing with some kind of mechanical problem or medical emergency. Instead, they find something that doesn't make sense. The boat is completely empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of explanations. The crew's personal belongings are scattered around exactly where you'd expect them to be. Coffee cups sit half-finished. Clothes hang neatly in bunks. The navigation equipment is working perfectly. There's plenty of fuel in the tanks and enough food and water to last weeks. Most unsettling of all, the holds are filled with rotting fish, suggesting the crew had been working normally before they vanished. Where are the 10 men who were supposed to be on this boat? Let's go back to understand how we got to this impossible moment. The story begins on Halloween night 2002, when the High Aim 6 left the port of Liuqiu in southern Taiwan. It was a routine departure for what should have been a routine fishing expedition. The boat was properly registered, properly equipped, and properly crewed with 10 Indonesian fishermen plus a Taiwanese captain and engineer. Captain Chen Tai-cheng had made this journey many times before. The Indonesian crew was experienced in long-line fishing operations. These weren't amateur fishermen heading out for a weekend trip. This was a professional operation with an experienced crew who knew these waters well. For the first few weeks, everything appeared normal. The boat's owner, Tsai Huang Shui, stayed in regular contact with Captain Chen. They discussed fishing conditions, weather patterns, and the usual business of commercial fishing. The last conversation took place sometime in December 2002. After that, silence. But here's where the story gets stranger. The High Aim 6 didn't just disappear, it kept sailing. For weeks, this ghost ship continued its journey across the ocean with no one at the helm. It travelled over 1,000 miles from its last known position, somehow navigating through some of the most challenging waters in the region. When Australian authorities finally boarded the vessel, they found a scene that defied logic. The boat showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication of panic or emergency. Personal effects remained undisturbed. Safety equipment was still in place. Even the ship's papers were neatly organised and easily accessible. The forensic team that examined the High Aim 6 after it was towed to Broome found themselves facing an impossible crime scene. There was simply nothing wrong with the boat that would explain why 10 experienced fishermen would abandon it. The vessel was seaworthy, well supplied, and functioning normally. Initial theories focused on illegal immigration. Australian authorities wondered if the High Aim 6 had been used to transport people seeking asylum, who might have abandoned the boat near the coast. But when investigators opened the fish holds, they found exactly what you'd expect on a fishing vessel. Rotting fish. Lots of rotting fish. Not the kind of cargo space you'd use to transport people. Pirates were another possibility. These waters weren't unknown to maritime criminals who might attack fishing vessels for their equipment or catch. But pirates don't typically leave valuable navigation equipment behind, and they certainly don't abandon a perfectly functional boat in the middle of the ocean. Weather was ruled out quickly. The High Aim 6 had weathered far worse storms than anything it encountered during its final voyage. The boat was designed for rough seas and had proven its durability many times over. Equipment failure seemed unlikely too. The engine was running when first spotted, and all critical systems were operational. Even if something had gone catastrophically wrong, experienced fishermen would have sent a distress signal, or at least left some indication of what happened. The investigation took a dark turn when Taiwanese police discovered that the cell phone belonging to the boat's engineer was still being used to make calls in Indonesia. Someone had the phone, and they were using it back on land. Following these digital breadcrumbs led investigators to track down one member of the Indonesian crew who had somehow made it back to his home province of North Sulawesi. Under questioning, this surviving crew member told a story that was both horrifying and incomplete. According to his account, on December 8, 2002, members of the Indonesian crew had murdered both Captain Chen Tai-cheng and engineer Lin Chung-lee. After killing the two Taiwanese officers, the Indonesian fishermen had somehow made their way back to their homeland, leaving the High Aim 6 to drift empty across the ocean. But even this confession raised more questions than it answered. How had 8 or 9 men gotten off a fishing boat in the middle of the ocean? Why would they commit mutiny when there was no evidence of mistreatment or conflict? How did they travel hundreds of miles to reach shore? And most puzzling of all, why would they leave behind a valuable vessel that could have been sold or used? SV Zebrina, 1917. There's something unsettling about the autumn of 1917. Not only has the war been raging for 3 years, but unease also hangs over the port of Falmouth on October 12th, as the crew of the sailing vessel Zebrina prepares for a seemingly routine coal run to France. Captain J. Archibald Martin, a seasoned mariner of 33 with weathered hands and sharp eyes, has steered this course many times before, from Falmouth to Saint-Brieuc. Although weather reports warn of relentless gales and heavy squalls battering the English Channel, coal remains desperately needed by the French, and the war leaves no room for delay. 3 days earlier, a similar attempt had been aborted as foul weather forced them back into port. On board the Zebrina, alongside Martin stands 4 experienced sailors. George Stewart, the 69-year-old mate who has long since earned his place as a repository of maritime knowledge, works alongside William Beck, a 26-year-old able seaman in his prime. Martin Faus, a 31-year-old hailing from Riga who brings international experience, and William Ferdinand Douglas Burke, a 17-year-old Londoner still learning the ropes but eager to prove himself. The Zebrina is a veteran vessel built in 1873 in Whitstable, designed for work rather than beauty. With her flat-bottomed hull and a modest tonnage of 189 tons across 100 feet of length, she was originally meant for navigating shallow rivers in South America. Now, she ferries Swansea coal to France with dependable reliability. By October 15th, though weather conditions remain bleak, time is of the essence. The cargo is secured and Captain Martin decides that despite the grim forecasts, they must set sail. As the vessel leaves Falmouth on a Monday morning, the crew falls into their well-practiced routines. The decks are cleared of coal dust, riggings are doubly checked, and the navigation equipment is calibrated. In his cabin, Captain Martin dutifully records in the ship's log. Departed Falmouth for Saint-Brieuc with coal cargo. The early hours pass uneventfully. The Zebrina steadily cuts through the choppy channel, yet below the calm the waters hide deadly dangers. German U-boats lurking like silent predators relentlessly seek out any ship carrying supplies to the Allied forces. Just that morning, vessels like the SS Heartburn near Swanage had already been sunk, and tales of other ships falling prey to torpedoes circulate among the sailors. As they venture deeper into the channel, the crew remains vigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of a periscope. The pressing tension of war has taught them that even a slight anomaly, a distant ripple, an unusual wave pattern, could signal impending disaster. With the wind growing stronger and the sea more turbulent, loose equipment is hurriedly secured, and sails are adjusted for the worsening conditions. Even so, the Zebrina, with her robust and time-tested design, appears more than capable of weathering a storm. Then, amid these escalating perils during the dark hours of October the 15th and 16th, something inexplicable occurs. Whatever the cause, be it a sudden catastrophic event or an eerie inexplicable force, the crew of the Zebrina finds themselves forced to abandon their ship. By dawn on October 16th, the vessel is observed sailing with no one on board. The sails remain set, the cargo undisturbed within the holds, and the galley fire continues to burn, preserving the remnants of a life abruptly interrupted. Tables remain set as if anticipating the next meal, but the ship bears no sign of human presence. Strangely, the vessel drifts onward under the power of wind and current, maintaining its eastward heading toward the French coast. It is almost as if the ship itself clings to a forgotten purpose, steering unerringly in the absence of its crew. Night falls, and by October 16th the Zebrina nears the rocky shoreline of northern France. Her flat bottom, once a liability, now proves a silent asset as it spares her from sustaining grave damage upon grounding. At Roselle Point near Dialette she finds rest, an abandoned ship washed ashore, yet remarkably intact. Local French authorities, alerted to the anomaly on the morning of October 17th, board the vessel. In a scene that defies explanation, they discover the ship in flawless condition. The cargo of Swansea coal remains firmly in place, personal belongings scattered as though the crew had only just stepped away, and the ship's papers lay undisturbed on Captain Martin's desk. The final log entry, a routine record of departure, offers no hint of the disaster that followed. Investigators pore over the minute details. The slight disarrangement in the rigging suggests they might have faced rough weather, but the Zebrina has weathered far worse in her decades of service. Naval records from the German forces fail to document any engagement with a merchant vessel on the critical days of October 15th to 16th. The logbook, untouched by marauding U-boat crews, remains as pristine as the day it was inscribed. With no rational explanation emerging, no evidence of an attack, no trace of storm-induced calamity, the mystery deepens. The experienced crew, whose lives had spanned tumultuous seas and endless conflict, have simply vanished. Despite systematic searches and thorough investigations, the fate of Captain Martin and his crew is lost in the grey mists between England and France, either taken by the inexorable forces of nature, or perhaps by something less tangible, something unspeakably eerie. For decades, the memory of the Zebrina and her missing crew would haunt maritime lore. The ship itself eventually found another life, repurposed as a houseboat until a destructive fire claimed her in 1953. But the mystery of that fateful autumn, when a seasoned crew vanished without a trace despite all evidence pointing to calm and order, remained an unsolved enigma, a ghostly tale that would continue to give chills to those who remember. Bellamica, 2006. There is something unsettling about the autumn of 1917. The war has dragged on for 3 years, and on October 12th, unease weighs over the port of Falmouth. The crew of the sailing vessel Zebrina is preparing for what should be a normal coal shipment to France. Captain J. Archibald Martin, a seasoned mariner of 33 with weathered hands and sharp eyes, has sailed this route many times, from Falmouth to Saint-Brieuc. Despite weather reports of fierce gales and heavy squalls in the English Channel, coal is urgently needed in France, and the war allows no delays. 3 days earlier, bad weather had forced them to turn back, but tonight they are determined to set sail. On board the Zebrina, the captain is joined by 4 experienced sailors. George Stewart, the 69-year-old mate, has long been known for his vast knowledge of the sea. Alongside him is William Beck, a 26-year-old able seaman, Martin Faus, a 31-year-old from Riga, who brings international experience, and William Ferdinand Douglas Burke, a 17-year-old Londoner still learning the ropes yet eager to prove himself. The Zebrina is a veteran workhorse built in 1873 in Whitstable. With her flat-bottomed hull and a modest 189-ton size on a 100-foot length, she was designed for hard work rather than for looks. Originally meant to navigate shallow rivers in South America, she now reliably ferries Swansea coal to France. By October 15th, even though the weather remains bleak, time is running out. The cargo is secured and the captain decides that they must sail despite the grim forecasts. On a Monday morning, as the vessel leaves Falmouth, the crew quickly falls into their regular routines. They clear coal dust from the decks, double-check the rigging and set the navigation equipment. In his cabin, Captain Martin records in the ship's log, "Departed Falmouth for Saint-Brieuc with coal cargo." The early hours pass without incident. The Zebrina cuts steadily through the choppy channel. However, danger lurks beneath the calm waters. German U-boats, hidden like silent predators, are on the lookout for any ship carrying supplies to the Allied forces. Just that morning, the SS Heartburn near Swanage had already been sunk, and there are many stories of ships being hit by torpedoes. As the Zebrina moves deeper into the channel, the crew stays alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of a periscope. The pressure of war has taught them that even a small ripple or strange wave pattern can signal trouble. With the wind picking up and the sea growing rougher, everyone works quickly to secure loose equipment and adjust the sails. Still, the sturdy design of the Zebrina seems more than capable of handling the storm. Then, during the dark hours of October 15th and 16th, something inexplicable happens. For reasons that are hard to explain, a sudden disaster, or perhaps a strange unseen force, the crew finds themselves forced to abandon ship. By dawn on October 16th, the vessel is seen sailing with no one on board. The sails remain set, the cargo stays intact, and the small fire in the galley continues to burn. Tables are still set for the next meal, yet the crew is gone. In a strange twist, the ship drifts on, carried by wind and current as it makes its way east toward the French coast. It seems almost as though the Zebrina has a will of its own, following a course that it knew before the crew disappeared. As night falls on October 16th, the Zebrina nears the rocky shoreline of northern France. Her flat bottom, once seen as a drawback, now becomes useful. It spares the ship from serious damage when she runs aground at Roselle Point near the village of Dialette. The ship remains intact despite being abandoned. French authorities are alerted to the unusual scene on the morning of October 17th. When they board the vessel, they find it in perfect condition. The Swansea coal is undisturbed, personal belongings are left just as they were, and the ship's papers lie untouched on Captain Martin's desk. The final log entry is simply the statement of departure, offering no clues about what happened afterward. Investigators examine every detail. Slight disorder of the rigging could suggest rough weather, but the Zebrina has weathered much worse over her long years. German naval records do not show any report of an attack on a merchant vessel during the critical days of October the 15th and 16th. The logbook remains pristine, as if no one had ever been on board. With no clear explanation, no sign of an attack and no evidence of a storm severe enough to force the crew off, the mystery deepens. The experienced men who'd spent their lives at sea and seen much of the world's storms and dangers vanish without a trace. Despite thorough searches, no sign of Captain Martin or his crew is ever found. Their fate has been lost somewhere in the grey waters between England and France, taken by the forces of nature or by something beyond understanding. In the years that follow, the story of the Zebrina and her missing crew becomes a haunting maritime legend. The ship herself is later repurposed as a houseboat, only to meet a fiery end in 1953. Yet, the baffling disappearance of the crew remains an unsolved mystery, a ghostly tale that continues to inspire both fear and wonder among those who hear it. MV Joyita, 1955. Sometimes the real story isn't in official reports, but in the words of regular people who saw the impossible. In the case of the MV Joyita, the most chilling stories come from those who knew the 25 people who disappeared into the Pacific in October 1955, not from the missing themselves. These are the people who watched them sail away on a trip to the Tokelau Islands that should have been routine. Captain Gerald Douglas, who had sailed Pacific waters for over 20 years, spotted something strange on November 10, 1955. As captain of the merchant vessel Tuvalu, travelling from Suva to Funafuti, Douglas was used to seeing floating debris. But what caught his eye was a boat, listing heavily to one side, its deck almost underwater. At first I thought it was just another wreck, Douglas told investigators. You see plenty of them out here, but as we got closer I saw it was different. The boat was still in one piece, still floating, but something was very wrong. Douglas had found the MV Joyita, 600 miles off course, drifting aimlessly in the waters that had become its grave. But the scariest part of Douglas's story wasn't the condition of the boat, it was the silence. There was no movement on deck, he said. No signals, no signs of life. Just this empty boat sitting there like it was waiting for someone to find it. I've never seen anything so disturbing in all my years at sea. To understand this, we need to hear from those who knew the people on the Joyita before they vanished. Their stories paint a picture of ordinary people on an ordinary trip that somehow went horribly wrong. Dr. Catherine Lomala, a University of Hawaii professor who owned the Joyita, had chartered it to Captain Thomas Dusty Miller, a 41-year-old British sailor who lived in the South Pacific. People who knew Miller said he was experienced and reliable, though maybe too willing to take risks when money was tight. Dusty knew that boat inside and out, said Captain S.B. Brown, another sailor who had sailed with Miller. He'd been doing charter trips and cargo runs for years. If anyone knew what the Joyita could and couldn't do, it was him. That's what makes this so impossible to explain. Brown's story was important for investigators trying to understand why Miller and his passengers abandoned what was basically an unsinkable boat. The Joyita's hull was lined with cork and her cargo hold was full of empty oil drums, which made it float even better. Miller knew this better than anyone. "I told investigators that Dusty would never have left that boat on purpose," Brown said. "He knew it couldn't sink, not completely. Something had to have happened to him for the others to panic like that." The passengers who boarded the Joyita on October 3, 1955 trusted Miller's skills. Dr. Alfred Andy Parsons, a World War II surgeon travelling to do an amputation, had sailed with Miller before and trusted him. Roger Perlis, a district officer heading to Tokelau, had asked to travel on the Joyita specifically because of Miller's reputation. But even before they left, there were warning signs that now seem important. Dock workers in Apia remembered the delays and mechanical problems that pushed back the Joyita's departure by almost a day. "The engine wasn't working right," said Toma Falauto, a dock supervisor who watched the repairs. "Captain Miller seemed annoyed but not worried. He said they could make the trip on one engine if they had to. I thought that was risky for an ocean voyage." The decision to sail with only one engine working would haunt the investigation. Maritime law usually requires boats to have backup engines for ocean trips, especially when they're carrying passengers. But Miller needed the money, and the Tokelau Islands needed their supplies. Chuck Simpson, Miller's 28-year-old American first mate, had told friends he was worried about the boat's condition before the trip. Sailors in Samoa later spoke of conversations where Simpson questioned some of Miller's choices. Chuck wasn't happy about a few things, remembered Pete Veiloa, a fisherman who often drank with Simpson. He thought the boat needed more work before they started doing regular runs. But he needed the job, and Miller was the captain. You don't argue with a captain if you want to keep working. The tension between Miller and Simpson would become important in later theories about what happened on the Joyita. Several people said their relationship was tense, and Simpson sometimes questioned Miller's decisions in front of others. The most touching stories came from family members who said goodbye to crew members who would never return. Takoka Tiweka, the 25-year-old bosun from Kiribati, had promised his wife he would send money home after this trip. His brother later told investigators that Takoka was excited about the steady work and wanted to save enough to bring his family to Samoa. He was a good sailor, his brother said, very careful, very responsible. He wouldn't have left the boat unless something terrible happened, something that made staying aboard impossible. The youngest crew member, 11-year-old Funuku Uluola Talama, was travelling as the adopted son of passengers Tokelau and Takamalapana. People at the dock remembered him being excited about the trip, his first time on such a long sea voyage. The thought of this child facing danger adds to the tragedy. Henry McCarthy Jr., the 27-year-old Samoan engineer, had worked on boats since he was a teenager. His friends said he was mechanically gifted and reliable in emergencies. If anyone could have kept the engines running, it would have been McCarthy. Henry could fix anything, said his cousin, who worked in the same shipyard. If the engine was running when they found the boat weeks later, that means Henry was doing his job until the end. That tells you it wasn't mechanical failure that made them leave. The passenger list included people whose stories would have been very valuable if they had survived. Dr. Parsons was known for staying calm under pressure, and District Officer Perlis had experience with emergencies and crisis management. Also important was James Woolwork, the harbour master who decided to join the trip at the last minute. Woolwork knew the route and the Joyita's abilities. His presence meant there were several experienced people who should have been able to handle most problems. When Captain Douglas's crew boarded the abandoned Joyita 5 weeks after it left, what they found went against everything people had said about those on board. The ship's clocks had stopped at 10:25 and the cabin lights were still on, suggesting that whatever happened occurred at night. You could tell people had been living on that boat normally until they left, Douglas said. Personal belongings were arranged like people expected to come back to them. It wasn't the kind of scene you'd find if people had time to plan an abandonment. The discovery of blood-stained bandages in a doctor's bag added a disturbing element to Douglas's story. Someone had been seriously injured, but Dr. Parsons had treated the patient and then left the ship along with everyone else. Radio operator Joseph Pereira from Tokelau was in charge of communications during the trip. The radio was tuned to the international distress frequency, suggesting he had been trying to call for help. But radio operators across the Pacific said they never received any distress calls from the Joyita. "We listen to that frequency all the time," said radio operator Frank Daniels from the Suva station. "If someone was transmitting on the emergency channel, we would have heard it. The silence was complete." The discovery that the radio's antenna cable had been painted over, limiting its range to just 2 miles, raised questions about whether the distress calls simply didn't travel far enough to reach help. Local fishermen reported no unusual weather when the abandonment likely occurred. They said conditions had been manageable for experienced sailors. "The seas were rough, but nothing we hadn't seen before," said Malupo Setefano, a Samoan fisherman. "A boat like the Joyita should have handled those conditions easily. We were out in smaller boats during that same period." The most haunting stories came from those who searched for the Joyita. Royal New Zealand Air Force pilots flew over 100,000 square miles of ocean, looking for any sign of the ship or its passengers. Flight Sergeant Jim Morrison, who flew multiple search missions, described the futility of searching endless water for 25 people who seemed to have vanished. "We covered every inch of ocean between Samoa and Tokelau," Morrison said. "We expanded the search area far beyond where they could possibly have drifted. We found nothing. No debris, no life rafts, no bodies. It was as if they had simply evaporated." The absence of debris was puzzling. The Joyita carried 3 life rafts, which should have been visible from the air. The fact that the searchers found no trace of them led some to believe they had been picked up by another vessel. When investigators spoke to Miller's financial contacts, they learned he was under pressure to pay off debts and was relying on government contracts to stay afloat. "Dusty was worried about money," admitted Captain Brown, "but he wasn't the type to do anything stupid because of debt. If anything, it would have made him more careful." Dr. Luomala, the boat's owner, said Miller was proud of his reputation and would never knowingly put passengers in danger. Her decision to charter the boat to him was based on years of seeing him operate carefully. Mary Celeste, 1872. In the summer of 1861, maritime shipping was on the rise. Steamers were changing ocean travel, but sailing ships still carried most cargo across the oceans. In the small shipbuilding town of Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, master craftsman Joshua Dewis was finishing a brigantine named Amazon. Built from local timber, the ship was sturdy and meant for trade. The Amazon started like many other merchant vessels, designed for profit, not fame. At 99 feet long and 25 feet wide, she had a cargo capacity that would ensure her owners made a decent living. When she launched on May 18, 1861, her 9 owners had no idea they were sending forth a ship that would become famous for mysteries. Her first captain, Robert McClellan, took pride in the Amazon's solid construction. The brigantine was built for routes that connected North America with Europe and the West Indies, carrying everything from timber to manufactured goods. McClellan saw the Amazon as an opportunity for steady work on well-established trade routes. However, trouble seemed to shadow the ship. During her maiden voyage in June 1861, McClellan fell seriously ill while supervising timber loading at Five Islands, Nova Scotia. His condition deteriorated quickly, forcing the Amazon to return to Spencer's Island, where McClellan died on June 19th, just a month after her launch. It was an ominous start for a ship expected to have a normal life at sea. Under new Captain John Nutting Parker, the Amazon completed her interrupted journey to London, but misfortune continued. She collided with fishing gear off Maine and sank a brig in the English Channel. While these incidents were not disastrous, they started a pattern of mishaps that would trouble the ship throughout her life. Over the next few years, the Amazon settled into the routine of a cargo vessel. She sailed back and forth across the Atlantic, carrying goods between North America, Europe, and the West Indies. Captain Parker commanded her effectively for 2 years, followed by Captain William Thompson until 1867. During this period, the ship's mate later said, "We went to the West Indies, England, and the Mediterranean. Nothing unusual happened. These were the Amazon's golden years, just another working ship making her way on familiar routes. She even visited Marseille, where an artist likely painted her portrait. This painting shows a well-kept brigantine under full sail representing reliability rather than adventure." The Amazon's comfortable existence ended dramatically in October 1867, when she was driven ashore by a storm at Cape Breton Island. The damage was severe, and her owners abandoned her as a total loss, For most ships, this would have been the end of the story, scrapped or left to decay. However, the Amazon found a second life when Alexander McBean from Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, bought her as a wreck. Within a month, he sold the vessel to a businessman who, in November 1868, transferred ownership to Richard W. Haynes, an American from New York. Haynes saw potential in the damaged brigantine and invested $8,825 in her restoration after buying her for just $1,750. When Haynes registered the rebuilt ship in December 1868, he renamed her Mary Celeste. This was common, ships often got new names with new ownership. But this change marked the start of the Amazon's transformation from a simple cargo ship into something eerie. Under American ownership, the Mary Celeste should have continued her profitable existence. The American merchant marine was growing after the Civil War, and skilled vessels were in high demand. But financial problems hit Haynes early on, and in October 1869, creditors took the ship and sold her to a New York group led by James H. Winchester. Winchester understood shipping and invested wisely. In early 1872, he commissioned a costly refit that transformed the Mary Celeste. Now, 103 feet long and with increased tonnage of 282 tons, she became more valuable and capable. This rebuilding also brought the Mary Celeste her most famous captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs. At 37, Briggs was well respected in the merchant marine. Born in Massachusetts into a seafaring family, he was deeply religious and married his cousin Sarah in 1862, having a tradition of bringing family on journeys. By 1872, Captain Briggs was well established, owning shares in multiple vessels. When Winchester offered him command of the Mary Celeste with part ownership, it signified the peak of his career. He would be captain of a fine vessel, ensuring security for his wife and children. Briggs chose his crew carefully for the Mary Celeste's final voyage. First mate Albert Richardson, married to Winchester's niece, had sailed with Briggs before. Second mate Andrew Gilling, though young, was experienced. The 4 German sailors were skilled and described as peaceable. Everything about the crew reflected Briggs's commitment to competence. In October 1872, the Mary Celeste prepared for a routine cargo run from New York to Genoa, carrying 1,701 barrels of alcohol. Briggs arranged for Sarah and their infant daughter Sophia to join him, while their son Arthur stayed home. Loading proceeded smoothly at Pier 50 on New York's East River. On November 3rd, Briggs wrote confidently to his mother, saying, "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage." Sarah expressed satisfaction with the crew, praising their quiet capability. On November 5th, the Mary Celeste left New York Harbor but anchored near Staten Island to wait for better weather. 2 days later, with conditions improving, she entered the Atlantic, starting what everyone expected to be an ordinary crossing to Italy. Captain Briggs, his family and 7 crew members began a voyage that would turn the Mary Celeste into the most famous ghost ship in maritime lore. On that November morning, as the Mary Celeste sailed out of sight, she was just another vessel carrying alcohol. Her cargo was valuable, her crew skilled, and her captain respected. She had withstood storms, struggles, ownership changes, and significant repairs. Through these challenges, she remained a reliable working ship. The change from ordinary vessel to legendary mystery began 4 weeks later, when the brigantine DEI Gracia saw an unmanned ship drifting between the Azores and Portugal. Captain David Morehouse sent first mate Oliver DeVoe to investigate, discovering the name Mary Celeste on the stern. What DeVoe found on board launched countless theories and made the Mary Celeste the most analysed maritime mystery ever. The ship was seaworthy, her cargo intact and her crew's belongings undisturbed. Yet, Captain Briggs, his wife, daughter, and all 7 crew members had disappeared without explanation. The Mary Celeste had transformed into not just a ship but a floating question mark that would haunt maritime history. Within hours of DeVoe's discovery, the Mary Celeste became a symbol of the sea's mysteries. Newspapers across America and Europe seized the story, and public imagination filled in the gaps with theories, ranging from possible to absurd. The salvage hearings in Gibraltar turned the mystery into an international sensation. Attorney General Frederick Solly Flood's dramatic accusations of mutiny and murder captured headlines, but forensic evidence failed to support his claims. The blood he thought was on Captain Briggs's sword turned out to be rust. Marks he saw as violence were merely natural wear. Still, the damage to Mary Celeste's reputation was lasting. The ship survived despite her mystery. After the Gibraltar hearings, she delivered her cargo to Genoa and returned to service under new owners. However, her reputation lingered. Sailors viewed her as cursed, and ship owners struggled to find crews willing to sail on a ship that had lost its crew without any explanation. For 13 more years, the Mary Celeste continued her work on Atlantic routes, but her glory days were over. She changed hands many times, each owner hoping to profit while battling the stigma of her mysterious past. Port authorities in Gibraltar noted her visits, as she attracted curious onlookers wanting to see the famous ghost ship. The Mary Celeste's tale ended on January 3, 1885, when Captain Gilman C. Parker wrecked her on the Rochelois Bank near Haiti as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Parker and his partners had loaded her with worthless goods, then destroyed the ship to collect insurance money. The scheme failed, Parker died in poverty, and the Mary Celeste finally found rest at the bottom of the ocean. SS Ourang Medan, 1940. Death has a certain smell. Sailors know this, and when the crew of the American merchant ship Silver Star climbed onto the drifting steamship in the Strait of Malacca, they were hit by a sickening odour. But it wasn't just the smell that shocked them. It was the sight they found sometime in late 1947 or early 1948. The deck of the SS Ourang Medan was covered in bodies. These weren't bodies from a battle or disease, but corpses frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Sailors lay on their backs, faces toward the sun, mouths open as if they had died screaming. Their eyes stared straight ahead, wide with horror, as if they'd seen something so frightening that their faces had frozen at that final moment. Even the ship's dog lay dead, teeth bared, as if fighting an invisible enemy when death took it too. To understand this, we need to go back to when radio operators across the South China Sea first heard the desperate voice from the Ourang Medan. The distress signal began normally. Radio operators were used to getting SOS calls for help, mechanical problems, medical emergencies, storms, but the message from the Dutch steamship Ourang Medan was different. SOS from Ourang Medan. We float, all officers including captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge. Probably whole crew dead. The radio operator would have noted the ship's location and alerted nearby vessels. However, before anyone could help, the voice from the Ourang Medan sent increasingly frantic messages. I die. Then silence. Complete absolute silence. 2 American ships, the City of Baltimore and the Silver Star, got these messages. Both immediately changed course to investigate. They followed standard maritime procedure. They expected to find a ship in trouble, perhaps a fire or a medical emergency. Instead, they found something that challenged everything they knew about death at sea. The Silver Star reached the Ourang Medan first, looking for the Dutch steamship. When they found her, drifting without a purpose, nothing seemed obviously wrong. The ship sat low in the water but didn't appear to be taking on water. Her hull seemed intact, however the lack of activity was unsettling. No one was on the bridge, no crew members were visible, no response to signals, just a silent ship drifting like a ghost. The boarding party expected to find survivors, hopefully the person who had sent the desperate radio messages. Instead, they were walking through a floating morgue where death had struck with impossible speed and precision. On the bridge, they found the captain slumped over the navigation equipment, his face frozen in the same terror. The radio operator sat at his station, dead while trying to send his last message. Officers lay in the chart room, but it was the expression on every face that truly disturbed the rescuers. These weren't men who had died peacefully or in ordinary accidents. Their faces were frozen in absolute horror, as if each had seen something so terrifying that terror itself had killed them. Moving deeper into the ship, the boarding party found that the radio messages hadn't even described how bad it was. It wasn't just the officers who were dead, the entire crew had perished, their bodies scattered throughout the ship, all with the same unnatural expressions of terror. The mystery deepened when the team realised that the bodies showed no clear signs of injury. No gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no signs of violence. Whatever had killed these men had done so without leaving any visible marks. Even more puzzling was how quickly death had struck. The positions of the bodies suggested the crew was doing its normal duties when whatever killed them struck simultaneously. This wasn't a slow disaster. It had overwhelmed everyone at once. The investigation was cut short when smoke began rising from the Ourang Medan's cargo hold. Sailors recognized the signs of a fire that could get out of control. With no working fire equipment and no idea what the cargo was, the boarding party evacuated immediately. They barely got back to the Silver Star before the mysterious cargo in the Ourang Medan's hold exploded. The explosion shattered the hull and sent debris flying. In minutes, the ship had turned into a raging inferno. The Ourang Medan sank quickly, taking with it any evidence that might have explained the crew's deaths. The rescue team could only watch as the ship disappeared. Even before the explosion, investigators struggled to understand what they had seen. How does an entire crew die at the same time without any clear cause? What could have caused such fear in experienced seamen? And what kind of cargo explodes so violently? The first theory was poisoning. A gas leak from the cargo hold could have killed the crew quickly. But this didn't explain the expressions of terror. People dying from gas usually lose consciousness gradually, not in terror. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a broken boiler system was another possibility. But again, these victims usually die peacefully. More unusual theories suggested the Ourang Medan carried some sort of chemical weapon. Given the time period, dangerous materials were being shipped. Nerve agents could cause rapid death, but it's questionable whether they would produce the specific terror-filled expressions. The explosion added more mystery. Normal cargo rarely explodes like that. This suggests the cargo manifest wasn't accurate, or the ship was involved in illegal activities. Some thought the ship might have been smuggling volatile chemicals or explosives, perhaps left over from the war. These could have released toxic gases and exploded when exposed to fire. Even that explanation struggled with the central mystery. What scared these sailors so much? Chemical poisoning usually doesn't cause such intense fear. The rapid destruction of the evidence made investigation even harder. The Ourang Medan went from a mystery to a pile of debris in hours. Official records further complicate the case. No record of a steamship named Ourang Medan can be found in Dutch maritime registries. The ship seems to have existed outside the system, without registration or insurance. This lack of documentation led some to believe the Ourang Medan was operating illegally, perhaps smuggling contraband. Such ships would avoid registration. The timing, right after World War II, provides context for illegal operations. The waters around Southeast Asia were full of vessels carrying everything from military surplus to black market goods. Even if the Ourang Medan was involved in illegal activities, investigators still couldn't explain what killed the crew so dramatically. Smugglers might avoid registration and carry dangerous cargo, but they still die like everyone else. The witness accounts from the Silver Star's crew remained consistent. Many sailors saw the same thing. An entire ship's crew dead with expressions of pure terror, followed by an explosion. However, consistency doesn't automatically prove the story's truth. Many details changed over time, which could mean that memories were unreliable or that some parts were embellished. The lack of records is a major challenge to accepting the Ourang Medan story as true. Despite the dramatic events, no official accident reports or government investigations from that time have been found. Radio logs, which should have recorded the distress signals, are also missing. Given that multiple ships allegedly received the calls, the absence of this evidence raises questions. Carroll A. Deering, 1921. When you're looking forward to 1921, the last thing you want is crew trouble. But that's what Captain Willis B. Wormel was dealing with as he prepared the Carroll A. Deering for a routine cargo run from Rio de Janeiro back to the US. The 66-year-old retired sea captain had come back to command this impressive 5-masted schooner and already regretted his decision. It started on August 26, 1920, although no one knew it at the time. The Carroll A. Deering had set sail from Norfolk, Virginia under Captain William H. Merritt, a World War I hero. Merritt's son Sewell was first mate. The ship carried a crew of 10 Scandinavian sailors, mostly Danes, and a cargo of coal bound for Brazil. Everything seemed normal until a few days in. Captain Merritt got so sick that the ship had to turn back. Both Merritt and his son left the ship, leaving the Deering Company searching for a replacement captain. They found Captain Wormel. Though he was retired, his experience made him the obvious choice. The company also hired Charles B. McClellan as first mate, a decision that would later cause problems. On September 8, 1920, the Carroll A. Deering sailed again under Wormel. Everything went as planned for a while. The trip to Brazil was uneventful, and the coal was delivered. That's when the first warning signs appeared. Captain Wormel gave his crew shore leave as usual and met with Captain George Goodwin, who commanded another cargo ship. Wormel told Goodwin he didn't trust his crew and that they were unruly. He spoke positively only of the engineer, Herbert Bates, whom Goodwin also knew. These weren't minor complaints. Wormel was genuinely worried about the crew's behaviour. It suggested something was seriously wrong with the ship's leadership and morale. On December 2, 1920, the Carroll A Deering left Rio de Janeiro for the US. The first stop was Bridgetown, Barbados, to take on supplies. It was there that the tensions between Captain Wormel and First Mate McClellan became public. While docked, McClellan got drunk and complained about Captain Wormel to other sailors. He told Captain Hugh Norton of the schooner Augustus W. Snow some troubling things. McClellan claimed he couldn't discipline the crew because Wormel interfered with his authority. He also said he had to do all the navigation because Wormel's eyesight was failing. These were serious accusations. A first mate questioning the captain's ability was rare. The ship's hierarchy depended on respect for the captain, and McClellan's drunken complaints caused a dangerous breakdown in that system. The situation worsened when McClellan made an even more ominous statement saying, "I'll get the captain before we get to Norfolk, I will." It sounded like a direct threat. McClellan's behaviour got so bad that the local authorities arrested him for public drunkenness. Wormel faced a difficult decision: leave his first mate in jail or bail him out and risk further conflict. On January 9, 1921, Wormel bailed McClellan out. Maybe he thought jail would sober McClellan up. Maybe he thought he could control the crew despite the obvious tension. Or perhaps he didn't want to explain to the Deering Company why he'd left his first mate in jail. The Carroll A Deering sailed for Virginia, beginning the final leg of a voyage already full of conflict. Captain Wormel had a beautiful ship, but he also had a first mate who had threatened him, and a crew whose loyalty was questionable. For over 2 weeks, the schooner sailed north through winter weather. The crew had to work together to handle the 5 massive masts and complex rigging, but beneath the surface the tensions continued. On January 28, 1921, the Carroll A Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship off North Carolina. The lightship keeper, Captain Thomas Jacobson, noticed odd things. The man who hailed the lightship had a foreign accent. It wasn't Captain Wormel. The man reported the ship had lost both anchors and chains and asked that the G.G. Deering Company be notified. Even more unusual was the crew's behaviour. Jacobson observed them milling around on the quarterdeck. This suggested either a breakdown in discipline or a situation where the chain of command was gone. The lightship keeper wanted to report this, but his radio wasn't working. The Carroll A Deering continued on, carrying whatever crisis was unfolding toward the dangerous waters off Cape Hatteras. On January 29th, another ship saw the Carroll A Deering sailing toward Diamond Shoals, known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The crew saw no one on deck. They assumed the crew would see the Cape Hatteras lighthouse or the Diamond Shoals lightship and change course. They were wrong. On January 31st, Coast Guard surfman C.P. Brady spotted the Carroll A Deering aground on Diamond Shoals. All her sails were still set. The 5-masted schooner sat motionless, with no signs of life aboard. Rescue ships tried to reach the vessel, but the weather was too rough. On February 4th, a rescue crew led by Captain James Carlson boarded the abandoned schooner. What they found was hard to explain. The ship was empty, but the scene suggested something more complex than a simple shipwreck. The crew's abandonment was methodical, not panicked. All personal belongings were gone, as were the lifeboats, life rafts, and navigation equipment. The ship's log was missing, but other evidence suggested violence or sabotage. The steering equipment was damaged. A sledgehammer lay nearby. This wasn't accidental damage. Most puzzling was the galley. Food was still being prepared. This suggested the crew's routine was interrupted suddenly. The rescue team's investigation was hampered by the ship's condition. The storms had opened her seams. They decided to destroy the ship with dynamite. The explosion that destroyed the Carroll A Deering eliminated any possibility of further investigation. The mystery launched a major maritime investigation. 5 government departments were involved. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover took a personal interest. The investigation considered everything from hurricanes to piracy to communist plots, but none fully explained the evidence. The most likely explanation remained mutiny. McClellan's threats and the crew discipline problems suggested tensions had finally erupted. The red-haired man who hailed the lightship supported the theory that someone else had taken control. But even the mutiny theory left crucial questions. If the crew had overthrown Captain Wormel, what happened next? Why would they damage the navigation equipment? How did 11 men disappear so completely that no trace of them was ever found? The investigation officially closed without any conclusions about the fate of the Carroll A. Deering's crew. The case file remained open, but no new evidence ever solved the mystery. Baychimo, 1931 to 1969. For 10 years, she was the most dependable ship in the Arctic. From 1921 to 1931, the SS Baychimo was the workhorse of the northern trade routes. She made the annual supply run to Hudson's Bay Company trading posts across the most remote parts of the Canadian Arctic and Alaska. Built in Sweden in 1914 as the Anger Manelfven, this steel-hulled cargo steamer was built for waters where other ships couldn't survive. The Hudson's Bay Company bought her in 1921 as part of Germany's World War I payments. They paid £15,000 for a ship that would be essential to their Arctic operations. At 230 feet long with a steam engine, the Baychimo could travel through ice-filled waters at 10 knots. Her steel hull could handle the pressure of the ice, and her large cargo capacity was big enough to supply entire communities through the long Arctic winters. Based out of Ardrossan, Scotland, the Baychimo followed a route that local Inuit communities depended on. Each year, as the Arctic summer opened the sea lanes, she would load up with supplies and trade goods in Vancouver or Montreal. Then she would begin the long journey north, above the Arctic Circle, to reach isolated trading posts with no other connection to the outside world. Her destinations included Herschel Island, Bernard Harbour and Cambridge Bay. These were lifelines for fur trappers, missionaries and indigenous families who relied on the Arctic economy. When the Baychimo arrived each summer, she brought supplies, news and mail from loved ones. The ship's crew, under Captain Sidney Cornwall, knew every hazard between Vancouver and the Beaufort Sea. They knew how to read ice conditions, when to push forward and when to wait. The Baychimo's voyages required not only skill, but also expertise of the Arctic, knowledge of currents, weather, and the behaviour of ice. For the Hudson's Bay Company, the Baychimo was more than just transportation. She was the base of their Arctic trading empire, connecting fur trappers to the markets of London and New York. Without reliable supply ships, the network of trading posts would collapse. Indigenous communities along her route also developed a relationship with the vessel. Children would watch for her stack on the horizon, knowing the Baychimo's arrival meant trade goods and news. For many, the ship's appearance was the most important event of the year. Captain Cornwall and his crew were proud of their reliability. Through 9 successful seasons, they never failed to complete their supply run. The Baychimo had survived Arctic storms, navigated through ice, and overcome mechanical problems. By 1931, she was known as one of the most dependable ships in Arctic waters. However, it was this very reliability that made the events of October 1931 so significant. On what should have been a routine trip, the Baychimo faced ice conditions more challenging than ever before. On October 1st, 1931, loaded with furs, the Baychimo got trapped in pack ice. This wasn't unusual. Captain Cornwall and his crew of 37 men waited, hoping the ice would break up. When the ice didn't break up, the situation got serious. The crew left the ship and walked to the town of Barrow. 2 days later, they returned to find the Baychimo had broken free and drifted away. The relief was short-lived. On October 8th, the Baychimo got trapped again. By October the 15th, the Hudson's Bay Company evacuated most of the crew, leaving 15 men to wait out the winter and salvage the ship. The 15 volunteers built a shelter and prepared for a long winter. The Arctic winter was coming and the ice wouldn't break up until the next year. It was a risk. On November 24th, a blizzard struck. When the storm passed, the men found the Baychimo had disappeared. The ice where she had been showed no trace of her. Captain Cornwall thought the ship had been crushed and sunk. It was a sad end, but not unheard of. However, an Inuit seal hunter brought news that changed everything. He'd seen the Baychimo about 45 miles away, floating in open water. The 15 men set out across the ice to find her. They found the Baychimo in good condition. The hull showed no damage. Faced with the winter, Captain Cornwall and his men made a difficult decision. They took the most valuable furs and arranged for them to be flown south. Then, they abandoned her. What happened next turned the Baychimo into the Arctic's most famous ghost ship. Instead of sinking, she began a second career. Reports came in from across the Arctic. Inuit hunters saw her drifting. Prospectors saw her frozen in an ice floe. Each sighting seemed to put her in a different place. In 1933, a group of Inupiat got trapped on board for 10 days during a storm. They had boarded to salvage whatever they could find, but weather trapped them. The sightings continued year after year. In 1939, a Captain Hugh Polson tried to salvage the Baychimo. However, moving ice forced him to give up. The Baychimo's apparent indestructibility was remarkable. Arctic conditions that would have destroyed other ships seemed only to carry her from place to place. The last confirmed sighting was in 1969, 38 years after her abandonment. Even then, she appeared in good condition. The Baychimo's story captured imaginations. It became a staple of maritime folklore. For the indigenous communities, the Baychimo took on almost supernatural meaning. She became part of their oral traditions, a reminder that the ice could preserve. The Hudson's Bay Company had written off the ship as a total loss, but the continued sightings kept the company in maritime news for decades. In 2006, the Alaskan government searched for the Baychimo, but the ghost ship has never been found. The Baychimo's legacy includes environmental and historical significance. Some say she should be recovered and restored. Others argue she should remain where the ice carried her, a monument to the power of the Arctic. Climate change has added urgency to the search. As ice patterns shift, the possibility increases that someone will find her. Whether she's on the ocean floor or still wandering, her discovery would close a major chapter in maritime history. Kaz II, 2007. The sound of a running engine shouldn't be scary, but when it's coming from an empty yacht in the Coral Sea, it's unsettling. On April 20th, 2007, Australian authorities boarded the catamaran Kaz II and found exactly that. A boat with everything working but no people. The laptop on the table was still on, the screen glowing. A half-finished coffee cup sat nearby. The radio worked, the GPS was on, and the safety equipment was ready. But Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead and James Tunstead, 3 experienced sailors, were gone. What made this discovery even more strange was how normal everything looked. It wasn't a mess like you'd expect after an emergency. The table was set, as if someone had just stepped away. Personal items were exactly where they should be. Even the laundry was neatly hanging. Yet Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead and James Tunstead, experienced sailors who had planned this trip carefully, had vanished without a distress signal or any clues. To understand how 3 capable sailors could disappear, we need to go back to the start of what should have been a normal trip. Derek Batten, 56, was looking forward to a sailing trip that would take him from Queensland around northern Australia. He had bought the Kaz II a year earlier and had already taken her on 2 successful trips. Batten wasn't new to sailing and he had taken courses. Batten was also cautious. He was going to make the trip with his wife, Jennifer, but he worried that 2 people might not be safe for such a long trip. The route they planned would take them through waters where the weather could change quickly. This concern led Batten to invite his neighbours, brothers Peter and James Tunstead, to join the voyage. Peter was 69 and James was 63, both retired and experienced with boats. The brothers had sailed together since they were 18 and had worked in the radio rooms of a volunteer sea rescue. They understood boats, weather and safety. The 3 men spent months planning their route using computer navigation software. They gave themselves 6 to 8 weeks, with no pressure to keep to a schedule. The plan was to stay near the shore, avoid night sailing for safety, and enjoy a cruise. On April 14, 2007, they tried to leave Airlie Beach but had to return because of GPS problems. This problem, user error, showed how careful the 3 men were. Instead of sailing with uncertain navigation, they fixed the problem and tried again. April 15th dawned clear and calm. The Kaz II was in excellent condition and had all the necessary safety gear. At about 6 a.m, the 3 men left Airlie Beach Marina. The first few hours went as planned. The catamaran's twin hulls cut through the water. They had fishing gear out and the mood was relaxed. At 10:05 a.m, James Tunstead used a video camera to record what would be the last footage of the 3 men. Derek was at the helm. Peter was fishing. The engine wasn't running. They were sailing. None of the 3 men were wearing life jackets. The last radio contact was that evening at 6:45 p.m. They reported their position. This was routine. But this routine radio call was also a little strange. The trip should have taken only 2.5 hours. It had taken them over 12 hours. Sometime after that call, everything went wrong. The GPS data showed the boat going adrift late on the afternoon of April 15th. Whatever happened to Derek Batten, Peter Tunstead and James Tunstead happened between that radio call and dawn on April 16th. The first sign of trouble came on April 18th, when a helicopter crew spotted the Kaz II drifting. The catamaran appeared to be unmanned. When authorities boarded the boat on April 20th, they expected to find evidence of an emergency. What they found was a functioning vessel that seemed to have been abandoned. The boat was in excellent condition with no damage. The engine was running. All navigation and communication equipment worked. The safety gear was unused, but the details were eerie. Food was set out on the table, like someone had just stepped away. The laptop was on and appeared to have been used recently. Coffee was still in the cups. These weren't signs of a boat abandoned in panic. One sail was badly torn, suggesting problems. Experienced sailors would have fixed this quickly. Police found no evidence of a struggle. Personal belongings were undisturbed. Firearm was properly stored. The video footage provided clues about the men's final hours. GPS data showed that after the 10:05 a.m. recording, the men had hauled in the white rope and put it on the foredeck. James Tunstead had taken off his shirt and glasses. Most importantly, the fishing line was tangled in the port rudder. This led to the official theory. If the fishing line had fouled the rudder, one of the men might have gone to free it. The official investigation concluded that James Tunstead might have fallen overboard while freeing the line. Peter Tunstead would have jumped in to rescue him. Derek Batten, realising he needed to turn the boat around, would have started the engine and left the helm. A change in wind could have caused a jibe, the boom swinging across the deck, and knocked Batten overboard. The Kaz II would have sailed away. The theory was consistent with the evidence, but it left questions. Why weren't they wearing life jackets? Alternative theories suggested other possibilities. Perhaps the men had transferred to another boat. The boat's fenders were out. However, small craft commonly do that when coastal cruising. Weather provided another explanation. Rough conditions could have made movement dangerous. A wave could have swept all three men overboard. The search and rescue effort was extensive. Despite searching thousands of square miles, no trace of the three men was found. The coronial inquest concluded that the men died in a series of accidents. But as the coroner noted in his report, I cannot be so definitive about the circumstances under which the deaths occurred. The exact events remained speculation. MV Stella Dawn, 1956. The distress signal came through garbled and desperate at 3:25 a.m. on December 12, 1978. Mayday, mayday, heavy weather, 40-degree list, cargo shifted. After that, only static. Those words from the German cargo vessel MS Munchen would launch one of the biggest maritime investigations in history. Yet even decades later, no one can explain how a state-of-the-art ship vanished from the North Atlantic with all 28 crew members aboard. The mystery begins with the ship herself. The MS Munchen wasn't an old rust bucket. She was barely a year old and a technological marvel of her time. Built in Hamburg in 1977, she was a lash carrier, lighter aboard ship, designed to revolutionize cargo handling. At 262 meters long and displacing 37,000 tons, the Munchen was enormous. Her steel hull met the highest safety standards and had watertight compartments to keep her afloat, even if sections were breached. Investigators looked at the final radio messages, trying to piece together what could overwhelm such a modern vessel in just a few hours. The initial theory was that the ship encountered severe weather and the cargo shifted, causing the 40-degree list mentioned in the distress call. However, this explanation began to fall apart as they examined the evidence. Rescue vessels reached the Munchen's last known position but found almost nothing. There were a few life jackets, some twisted metal, and about 20 containers that had broken free from the ship. For such a massive vessel to disappear without a trace suggested something beyond ordinary maritime accidents. Weather analysis added to the mystery. The storm was certainly fierce, with wind gusts over 60 knots and waves up to 30 feet. However, ships of her size regularly weathered worse conditions without issue. The storm was within parameters she was built to handle. Next, investigators checked the cargo manifest, hoping that improper loading contributed to the disaster. The Munchen carried 83 containers and barges loaded with general cargo, nothing particularly dangerous. The ship's loading computers had calculated proper weight distribution, and inspectors had verified that everything was secured. If the cargo shifted enough to cause a 40-degree list, something extraordinary must have caused that failure. Marine architects then analysed the ship's design. Models showed that even if cargo had shifted dramatically, the ship's compartments should have prevented catastrophic flooding. The vessel had enough reserve buoyancy to survive major damage to several hull sections. Investigators began to wonder if the Munchen had suffered structural failure. Analysis of a few recovered pieces of wreckage revealed metal that had been stressed well beyond what weather could produce. Some sections showed signs of twisting and bending not typical for regular conditions. The breakthrough came from satellite data that had recently become available. Scientists discovered evidence of rogue waves, massive waves that could reach 80 feet or more in height. These waves formed when swells from different storms met in perfect conditions, creating extremely powerful waves capable of striking ships with incredible force. The rogue wave theory made sense of the Munchen's disappearance. If the ship had been struck by one or more of these waves, the impact could have caused immediate structural damage and loss of stability. Such waves could hit without warning, giving the crew no time to react. Computer simulations showed disturbing possibilities. Though the Munchen was designed well, her structure could be vulnerable to extreme wave action. The large, flat cargo deck could channel large volumes of water into the vessel if hit from the wrong angle. However, the rogue wave theory raised more questions. If the Munchen had been struck by waves, why did she transmit distress signals for more than 30 hours before vanishing? Rogue waves typically cause immediate damage. They don't lead to prolonged emergencies with time for radio communications. Analysis of the distress signals revealed that the radio officer had sent position updates for over a day after the initial mayday. These messages indicated that while the vessel was in serious trouble, it wasn't in immediate danger of sinking. The crew seemed to be dealing with a manageable crisis until something shifted dramatically. This led to a more complex theory. Perhaps the Munchen was initially damaged but not destroyed by rogue waves. The crew might have dealt with flooding but managed to keep the ship afloat. But then, a second wave or a series of waves might have delivered the final blow that sent her down. Historical weather data supported this multi-stage scenario. The storm system had created multiple wave trains, making conditions ripe for rogue wave formation. The ship could have faced several such waves, each inflicting cumulative damage until her integrity failed. Investigators also considered human factors. The Munchen's crew was skilled, but they had never dealt with a lash carrier in extreme conditions. The ship was so new that emergency procedures may not have applied to her unique configuration. Reports revealed stability problems on similar ships, though none had been lost. Other vessels described incidents of shifting cargo and unexpected wave actions, leading to stability issues. These findings suggested that while she was well built, her design might have had unforeseen vulnerabilities in extreme conditions. Underwater search efforts eventually found the Munchen's wreck. The debris showed evidence of catastrophic failure. The ship had broken apart violently, with sections scattered over several square miles. This destruction matched either massive wave impact or explosive decompression during rapid descent. Examination of the wreck showed she likely sank bow first, with the stern separating during the descent. This pattern suggested flooding progressed quickly in the forward sections, overwhelming her watertight integrity. The recovery of the voyage data recorder provided crucial evidence. It recorded the final hours of the Munchen, showing the crew fought increasing stability issues as water accumulated in damaged areas. Radio communications revealed rising desperation as standard control measures failed. Despite this extensive evidence, investigators couldn't find complete certainty about the exact events that sank the Munchen. The combination of extreme weather, rogue waves, and cargo dynamics created a failure scenario that defied simple explanation. The final report said rogue waves were the likely cause, but acknowledged that several contributing factors played a role. These included the ship's design, cargo loading patterns, crew responses, and weather conditions. The tragedy transformed the understanding of extreme weather and its effects on large vessels. The case provided evidence for rogue waves, previously dismissed by experts. Subsequent research confirmed that such waves are real and pose risks to maritime operations. The disaster also led to improvements in ship design standards and emergency protocols. New regulations addressed better securing systems for cargo and improved stability calculations for extreme conditions, yet the core mystery of the Munchen remains. How does a ship built to withstand the worst conditions completely fail? Investigators provided probable answers, but left many details locked beneath the Atlantic waves. Modern research continues to refine theories about the Munchen's loss, revealing more complexities in the interaction between ships and weather. Each new discovery opens up more questions about how even the largest vessels can be overwhelmed by nature. SS Waratah, 1909. In the summer of 1909, luxury meant something different than it does today. It meant polished brass fittings, first-class dining rooms with crystal chandeliers, and the promise of safe passage across the world's most dangerous waters. The SS Waratah represented the pinnacle of modern maritime engineering, a brand new passenger steamer built for the Blue Anchor Line just 1 year earlier. But as the evening of July 26, 1909 approached in Durban, South Africa, one passenger was about to make a decision that would save his life and haunt maritime history forever. The Waratah had arrived in Durban from London via Cape Town, carrying 92 passengers and 119 crew members. Among those passengers was Claude Sawyer, an experienced traveller who had booked passage all the way to England. But something was wrong. Throughout the voyage from London, Sawyer had noticed the ship's behaviour in the water. She seemed to roll too heavily, taking too long to right herself after each wave. The ship felt unstable, as if she was carrying her weight in all the wrong places. On the morning of departure day, Sawyer made an unprecedented decision. Despite having paid for passage to England, he left the ship and booked alternate transport on another vessel. His reasons were simple but chilling. He believed the Waratah was going to sink. Fellow passengers laughed at his superstitions, but Sawyer was firm. He had experienced vivid dreams of a man covered in blood warning him of danger ahead. At exactly 8:15 p.m. on July 26, 1909, the SS Waratah departed Durban Harbour bound for Cape Town with 211 souls aboard. The ship was fully loaded with cargo and passengers, her holds filled with everything from woolen hides to gold and precious minerals. Captain Joshua Ilbery, an experienced mariner with over 20 years at sea, was confident in his vessel despite some concerns about her stability that had been raised during construction. The first hours of the voyage proceeded normally. Around 4 a.m. on July 27th, approximately 8 hours after departure, the Waratah encountered another vessel, the steamship clan McIntyre. The two ships exchanged signal lamp communications as they passed each other near the mouth of the Bashi River. The Waratah appeared to be making good speed, estimated at around 13 knots, and showed no signs of distress. This would be the last confirmed sighting of the ship or anyone aboard her. What happened next remains one of maritime history's greatest mysteries. The Waratah was scheduled to arrive in Cape Town on July 29th, but she never appeared. When the ship failed to arrive on schedule, concern quickly turned to alarm. The Union Castle Line vessels and other ships began searching the coastline but found nothing. No wreckage, no lifeboats, no bodies, no trace whatsoever of the massive steamer or the 211 people aboard. The mystery deepened when investigators began examining what little evidence existed. The weather conditions on July 27th and 28th had been challenging, with reports of severe storms along the South African coast. But ships were designed to handle rough weather, and the Waratah was brand new with modern safety equipment. How could an entire passenger liner simply vanish without sending even a single distress signal? The British Board of Trade immediately launched a formal inquiry into the disappearance. What they discovered raised disturbing questions about the ship's design and stability. During the inquiry, experts testified that the Waratah's metacentric height, the measurement that determines a ship's stability, was dangerously low at just 0.26 feet. This was far below what naval architects considered safe for a vessel of her size and type. Claude Sawyer's testimony became crucial to understanding the ship's final voyage. He described how the Waratah had exhibited concerning behaviour during her previous legs of the journey. The ship would roll heavily to one side and take an unusually long time to right herself. This sluggish recovery time suggested fundamental stability problems that could prove fatal in heavy weather. The court inquiry concluded that the Waratah had encountered a storm of exceptional violence and had likely capsized. But this explanation satisfied few people. Modern passenger steamers were built to survive storms, and the Waratah carried enough lifeboats and safety equipment to save everyone aboard if there had been time to use them. The complete absence of any wreckage or survivor evidence suggested something far more catastrophic had occurred. Over the decades, numerous theories have emerged to explain the Waratah's fate. Some investigators believe the ship encountered a rogue wave, one of those rare, massive waves that can reach heights of 80 feet or more. Such a wave could potentially overwhelm even a large steamer if it caught the vessel at the wrong angle, especially one already compromised by stability issues. Other experts have suggested that the ship's cargo may have shifted during the storm, causing a sudden and catastrophic loss of stability. The Waratah was carrying a mixed load including heavy mining equipment and precious metals. If this cargo broke free from its moorings during rough weather, it could have caused the ship to list severely and capsize within minutes. A more controversial theory involves the possibility of an explosion. The Waratah carried various industrial chemicals and mining supplies that could potentially have caused a devastating blast. Such an explosion might explain the complete absence of wreckage. If the ship broke apart and sank quickly in deep water, debris might have scattered over a vast area or sunk immediately. The search for the Waratah became one of the most extensive maritime investigations in history. The Royal Navy dispatched HMS Pandora and HMS Forte to search the South African coastline. Private vessels joined the effort, scanning hundreds of miles of ocean for any trace of the missing ship. Every reported sighting was investigated, from pieces of timber to alleged distress signals, but none proved connected to the Waratah. In 1910, wreckage from an unknown vessel washed ashore near Cape Town, raising hopes that the mystery might finally be solved. The debris included pieces of timber, furniture, and personal effects, but maritime experts could not definitively link any of it to the missing steamer. Without clear identification markings, the wreckage remained just another piece of the puzzle. Modern search efforts have utilized advanced sonar technology and deep-sea exploration techniques. In 1999, maritime researcher Emlyn Brown announced that his team had located a promising wreck site off the South African coast using side-scan sonar. The outline of the wreck appeared to match the Waratah's dimensions, generating international excitement. However, when divers reached the wreck in 2001, they discovered it was actually a World War II vessel, not the missing passenger liner. Brown continued his search for over 2 decades, conducting multiple expeditions and investigating numerous sonar contacts. In 2004, after 22 years of searching, he announced that he was abandoning the effort, stating that he had exhausted all reasonable possibilities. His failure to locate the wreck, despite extensive resources and advanced technology, only deepened the mystery surrounding the Waratah's fate. The passenger manifests reveal the human cost of the disappearance. Among those lost were families travelling to start new lives, businessmen conducting trade, and crew members supporting their families back home. The Hay family, Agnes Hay and her daughter Helen, were travelling to Cape Town for what should have been a routine journey. Instead, they became part of one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. Recent computer simulations and oceanographic studies have attempted to determine where the Waratah might have sunk, based on weather patterns, ocean currents, and the ship's last known position. These studies suggest the vessel likely encountered the storm while crossing the continental shelf off the South African coast, where deep ocean meets shallow waters, a region known for particularly dangerous sea conditions. Lady Lovibond, 1748. There are places on Earth where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where the laws of physics seem to bend. Off the coast of England, 6 miles from Deal in Kent, lies one such place, the Goodwin Sands. This 10-mile stretch of shifting sandbanks has been the graveyard of over 2,000 ships. Sailors call it the ship swallower. Any ship running aground will break apart and sink within hours. Among all the tragedies that have happened there, one story stands out, not just for the horror, but for what happened later. The Goodwin Sands earned their reputation long before the 18th century. Located in the Strait of Dover, where the English Channel meets the North Sea, these shifting sandbanks lie in the path of major shipping lanes. The waters are unpredictable. Ships that got too close found themselves trapped as the tide went out, leaving them stranded on sand that would soon swallow them. By 1748, dozens of ships had met their end there, making the sands one of the most feared hazards in British waters. Into this dangerous area came a 3-masted schooner that would become more famous in death than in life. Records show that ships regularly sailed these waters, carrying passengers and cargo between London and Europe. The Lady Lovibond was reportedly one such vessel handling routine voyages. On February 13, 1748, the Lady Lovibond left London bound for Portugal. According to legend, she carried Captain Simon Peel, who had recently married. The ship was loaded with cargo and around 50 passengers and crew, including wedding guests. It was meant to be a joyous journey, a honeymoon combining business with pleasure. However, someone aboard the Lady Lovibond felt differently. The first mate, named Rivers, reportedly loved the captain's new bride. Consumed by jealousy, Rivers waited for his chance for revenge. As the schooner approached the Goodwin Sands, Rivers steered the Lady Lovibond directly into the sand. The ship struck with tremendous force, her hull cracking. Within hours, the sands had claimed another victim. The Lady Lovibond broke apart and sank, taking Captain Peel, his bride, Rivers, and all aboard to their deaths. That should have been the end of the story. However, it was only the beginning. Exactly 50 years later, on February 13th, 1798, something strange happened. Captain James Westlake of the Edenbridge was navigating the same waters when his lookout spotted a schooner sailing under full sail near the sandbank. Westlake ordered his crew to prepare for the rescue, but as they watched, the schooner sailed onto the Goodwin Sands and vanished. No wreckage floated to the surface. The ship had seemed real one moment, then disappeared completely. When Westlake reported this, he learned that other vessels had seen the same thing. The phantom schooner matched historical descriptions of the Lady Lovibond. The sighting might have been dismissed, but what happened next turned the Lady Lovibond into a legend. On February 13, 1848, exactly 100 years after the wreck, multiple witnesses again reported seeing a schooner near the Goodwin Sands. They described a ghostly ship sailing toward the sandbank before disappearing. The pattern became clear when the same thing happened again 50 years later. On February 13, 1898, the phantom Lady Lovibond appeared again. This time, witnesses included the crew of a lifeboat who had responded to reports of a vessel in distress. They rowed out to the location but found only empty water. The timing, exactly 50 years to the day, convinced skeptical people that something supernatural was happening. Maritime communities along the Kent coast began to plan for the next appearance. As February 13, 1948 approached, local newspapers sent reporters to the area. The Royal Navy sent vessels to investigate any sightings. People gathered on the cliffs hoping to see the phantom ship. They weren't disappointed. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a vessel materialize near the Goodwin Sands on that February night. The sightings followed the same pattern. The ghostly schooner appeared, struggled against invisible forces, then sailed onto the sandbank and vanished. Photographers tried to take pictures, but their pictures showed only empty water. The appearances of the Lady Lovibond attracted attention from all over the world. Paranormal researchers, historians and tourists visited the Kent coast every 50 years. The legend grew beyond its original maritime context, inspiring books and articles about ghost ships. Scientific explanations were offered for the sightings. The Goodwin Sands area has unusual atmospheric conditions that can create optical illusions. Temperature inversions can make distant objects appear closer or create mirages that look like ships. The timing of the sightings, always on February 13th and always at 50-year intervals, suggested specific weather conditions might be responsible. However, these explanations couldn't account for the consistent witness descriptions. People who'd never heard of the Lady Lovibond were described seeing a schooner in distress, matching historical accounts of the original vessel. The phantom ship was always reported as sailing the same course, struggling against the same forces and vanishing at the same location. The story became embedded in local traditions, with communities marking each anniversary. The legend influenced local tourism, with businesses capitalizing on the supernatural attraction. Maritime safety authorities had to deal with practical problems created by the legend. Each anniversary brought more boat traffic to the dangerous waters as people tried to witness the phantom ship. The hazards that had claimed the Lady Lovibond continued to threaten modern vessels whose crews were distracted. The story influenced maritime law and rescue procedures. The reports of a ship in distress led to unnecessary rescue operations. The legend created a challenge for authorities: how to respond to reports of vessels in distress while knowing that some sightings might be supernatural. Modern technology has added new mysteries. Radar operators have occasionally detected phantom contacts near the Goodwin Sands on February 13th, showing blips that appear and disappear. Sonar surveys have revealed numerous wrecks beneath the sands, but none that can be identified as the Lady Lovibond. The quicksand means that wrecks from centuries ago may be buried too deep to recover. As the most recent anniversary approached in 1998, the Lady Lovibond faced its biggest test. Modern skepticism and technology should have been able to prove or disprove the legend. Media crews with cameras and recording equipment positioned themselves around the Goodwin Sands. Marine radar monitored the waters. Weather stations tracked atmospheric conditions. HMS Erebus and Terror, 1845. September 2nd, 2014. A light blinking on the sonar screen of a Parks Canada research vessel revealed an image that no one had expected. Some 24 feet below the dark, icy waters of Queen Maud Gulf, a ship's mast stood tall and clear. Senior underwater archaeologist Ryan Harris could hardly believe his eyes. After years of searching across countless miles of hostile frozen water, they had finally found HMS Erebus, one half of the Royal Navy's fabled lost expedition, exactly where Inuit tradition had long said it would be. The discovery revived forgotten questions. How could two of Britain's most advanced warships, built for the harsh Arctic and loaded with supplies for years, end up abandoned here? And what was the fate of the 129 officers and crew who set out on that promising May morning in 1845? 2 years later, on September 12th, 2016, another shocking piece of the past emerged in Terror Bay. Under just 24 metres of water, HMS Terror was found largely intact. Her hull was unbroken, and her decks appeared almost ready for service, as if the crew had only stepped off moments before. This ship, commanded by Captain Francis Crozier during the terrifying final days of the expedition, was preserved well enough that divers could peer through its windows into sealed rooms that had not been opened in over 170 years. To understand how these vessels became frozen monuments in a land of ice and snow, we must look back to May 19, 1845, in Greenhithe, England. In the early morning mist along the Thames, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror prepared for a journey that promised triumph. These ships were not ordinary vessels. In fact, they were bomb ships, robust warships built to endure extreme forces, with hulls reinforced by heavy oak timbers and iron plating. They even carried steam engines alongside traditional sails. Each ship contained modern advances of the era: steam heating systems to ward off the bitter cold, specially designed iron water tanks to stop freezing, and libraries stocked with over 1,200 books to pass the long Arctic nights. Sir John Franklin, 59 years old and experienced from previous Arctic trips, was in command. His mission was to find the legendary Northwest Passage, a route that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by sailing through Canada's icy north. The chosen crew of 129 included seasoned officers like Captain Francis Crozier, who had learned much from earlier Arctic journeys with James Clark Ross, and Commander James Fitzjames, the promising captain of HMS Erebus. Other crew members, from engineers to maintain the new steam engines to ice masters well versed in frozen seas and scientists set to record weather and magnetic changes, all played a critical part. On the morning of departure, throngs of well-wishers lined the shore. Engravings in the Illustrated London News captured the splendid sight of the two ships, their sails set and steam rising from their funnels, the largest and best-equipped Arctic expedition ever assembled. Loaded with 3 years of supplies, each ship carried 8,000 tins of preserved meat, 5,000 pounds of flour, 3,600 gallons of spirits, and even luxuries such as fine china and silver cutlery. The voyage began without incident. The ships crossed the Atlantic and reached Disco Bay, Greenland in July 1845. From there, Franklin sent his last official report describing healthy and high-spirited men. After a brief supply stop, the ship sailed north into the icy waters of Baffin Bay, vanishing into a maze of ice that would later serve as their eternal prison. For the first summer, the expedition followed familiar routes through Lancaster Sound and Barrow Strait. Franklin's plan was to freeze the ships into the ice at Beechy Island for the winter, a common and careful practice in Arctic travel. Evidence gathered later showed that the crew had built workshops, stored food, and even undertaken scientific studies during that first long night. Sadly, 3 men, John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain, lost their lives in that bitter season. Their bodies were later discovered, remarkably preserved by the permafrost, a stark testimony to the harshness of the environment. When spring of 1846 finally arrived, the ships broke free from their icy anchor and set off again, this time moving south through Peel Sound. Franklin pressed on, moving into less charted waters and relying on incomplete maps and hopeful predictions about the shrinking ice. Yet soon, fate proved unkind. By September 1846, both ships became trapped by thick, shifting ice near King William Island. Unlike the previous winter plan, this ice was uncontrolled and relentless. The ships' paths were slowly crushed as the ice pressed in from every side, and the brief summer passed without offering any relief. That second winter proved even more brutal. Provisions dwindled and scurvy began to affect the crew despite strict rations of lime juice and preserved foods. The steam engines, running on a limited supply of coal, drained what little extra energy they had. The mood among the men darkened as they realised they must endure yet another long, harsh winter without hope for rescue. Then, on June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin died under uncertain circumstances. Command fell to Captain Crozier, who faced nearly impossible choices with dwindling supplies and a weakened crew. Finally, on April 22, 1848, Crozier ordered the ships to be abandoned. The remaining 105 crew members loaded what they could onto sledges and began a desperate trek across the ice toward a Hudson's Bay Company post nearly 600 miles away. Every step was a gamble in one of the world's harshest environments, and hope faded with every mile. Years later, the frozen wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror told their silent tale. Divers discovered Erebus broken into pieces on the seabed, yet many artifacts remained in place. Dishes in the officers' mess, navigational tools at their stations, and even the ship's bell with its inscription still visible. In contrast, Terror lay upright as though carefully set aside, with hatches secured and precious equipment neatly stored away below decks. Some even saw the ship's wheel still in position, as if waiting for one last command. Questions lingered as researchers compared the two sites. Why did one ship appear to have been carefully abandoned while the other was shattered by icy forces? Artifacts and documents found inside Terror hinted that the ships might have been abandoned at different times, a detail that challenged the old stories of a single, unified evacuation. Inside HMS Terror, the preserved remains of 19th century life appeared almost untouched by time. The captain's cabin still held its original furniture, and food cans with labels just legible enough to read were found in storage. Detailed logbooks and navigation charts revealed Franklin's decision to steer west around King William Island instead of taking a safer eastern route, a choice that ultimately sealed the fate of the expedition. Other evidence pointed to another danger: lead poisoning. Many of the food tins showed signs of poor soldering, which likely allowed toxic lead to seep into the provisions. Over time, this poisoning could have weakened the crew both mentally and physically, adding to their grim predicament. In the end, the frozen remains of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror stand as frozen monuments to ambition, hope, and the relentless power of the Arctic. Their discovery has helped us piece together a lost chapter of maritime history, a story of bravery, misfortune, and the unforgiving ice. The legacy of Franklin's expedition continues to remind us of the fine line between human daring and the might of nature. MS Munchen, 1978. Sometimes, even the most advanced technology can't withstand the brutal power of nature. On December 12, 1978, radio operators across the North Atlantic heard a distress call that would spark one of the most intense maritime investigations of the era. The German cargo ship MS Munchen was sending emergency signals from stormy waters between Europe and North America, reporting severe weather damage and requesting immediate assistance. Then, without warning, the radio went silent. What happened next would challenge many ideas about ship design and the ocean's might. The MS Munchen was not an ordinary cargo vessel. Built in 1972 at Carroll shipyard in Belgium, she was a lash carrier, short for lighter aboard ship, designed to handle tough ocean conditions. At 261 metres long and weighing over 24,000 tonnes, her builders and operators at Hapag-Lloyd believed she was virtually unsinkable. Investigation into her disappearance began with a timeline. On December 7, 1978, the Munchen left Bremerhaven, Germany, under Captain Johann Danekamp, bound for Savannah, Georgia, with a cargo of steel products and machinery. This was a routine trip. She had made this journey dozens of times without incident. The crew consisted of 28 experienced officers and seamen, all familiar with North Atlantic winter weather. Reports from December revealed that the Munchen had sailed directly into one of the most severe storm systems recorded in the North Atlantic. Hurricane-force winds exceeding 70 knots, combined with huge seas, created conditions that tested even robust vessels. However, the Munchen was built to handle such weather, designed to withstand waves up to 15 meters high and winds close to 100 knots. The first sign of trouble came from radio logs kept by coastal stations. On December 12th, just 5 days after departure, the Munchen began sending distress signals. The messages were fragmented and difficult to understand due to interference, but radio operators clearly heard reports of severe weather damage. The ship was about 600 nautical miles southwest of Ireland, in some of the most dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. Maritime authorities from Germany and the UK quickly dispatched search vessels to the area. The rescue ship Smit Rotterdam, alongside several commercial vessels, turned towards the Munchen's last known position. Aircraft from multiple nations joined the search, scanning thousands of square miles of turbulent ocean for any sign of the missing ship. What they found raised more questions than answers. On December 13th, searchers located 2 of the Munchen's lifeboats floating empty in the heavy seas. The lifeboats showed signs of extreme damage. Not the controlled launching expected in an orderly abandoned ship procedure, but violent separation from the mother vessel. Metal brackets had been torn rather than released, suggesting the boats had been ripped from their davits by powerful forces. The condition of the lifeboats offered crucial clues. Standard safety procedures require lifeboats to be launched and crewed during emergencies. Finding them empty and damaged indicated that the ship likely faced a sudden and catastrophic event, leaving the crew no time for proper evacuation. They either couldn't reach the lifeboats or couldn't launch them due to overwhelming conditions. Maritime investigators considered several theories to explain the Munchen's fate. The first theory suggested structural failure due to the extreme weather. Even vessels built for harsh conditions have limits, and the North Atlantic in December 1978 was pushing those limits. Many ships reported damage during the same storm, but none suffered total loss like the Munchen. This theory gained support from examinations of the damaged lifeboats. Metallurgical analysis revealed stress fractures consistent with a hull breaking apart under extreme pressure. Investigators created computer models of the Munchen's design, which showed potential weak points where concentrated loads might exceed the steel's limits. If the ship encountered waves larger than designed for, catastrophic failure could occur. However, this explanation troubled many. The MS Munchen was a relatively new vessel designed with the best standards of the 1970s. Her steel construction used advanced welding techniques and high-strength materials. Independent reviews of her design found no obvious flaws that would have led to sudden failure. For such a robust ship to be destroyed so completely, something extraordinary must have happened. A second theory came from eyewitness accounts of other ships in the area during the storm. Several captains reported seeing waves far larger than expected, vast walls of water that seemed to appear suddenly. These rogue waves were often dismissed as maritime myths, until the investigation into the Munchen brought them under scientific scrutiny. Traditional wave theory stated that North Atlantic waves rarely exceeded 12 to 15 meters, even in severe storms. Ships were built to handle these conditions, but if waves of 20 or even 25 meters struck the Munchen, the forces involved would far exceed engineering calculations. A massive wave hitting the ship at the wrong angle could break it apart or cause it to capsize. The rogue wave theory gained traction when investigators found other vessels reported unusual wave activity in the same area. The Norwegian tanker Wilstar had suffered structural damage from a large wave in 1974, not far from where their Munchen vanished. Weather buoys in the region recorded wave heights that seemed impossible according to existing models. Physical evidence also supported the rogue wave theory. Instead of debris scattered across a wide area, investigators found wreckage concentrated in a small zone. This pattern suggested the ship had been destroyed quickly by a single catastrophic wave, rather than weakened over time by rough seas. A third theory focused on the possibility of cargo shifting during the storm. The lash system used by the Munchen involved loading standardized cargo containers onto floating barges, then transferring them onto the ship. If the securing system failed during rough weather, hundreds of tons of cargo could shift suddenly, causing the ship to list and potentially capsize. Cargo shift accidents had troubled vessels in the past, but rarely ships as large as the Munchen. Loading records showed she had been packed according to standards. However, the extreme forces from a major North Atlantic storm could overwhelm any securing system. Researchers reviewed computer simulations of cargo shifts. If enough cargo broke free at once, the change in the ship's centre of gravity could lead to rapid capsizing. Still, these simulations indicated that modern securing systems should have handled the storm's conditions. For cargo shift to cause the disaster, the forces would have to be beyond normal design limits. The investigation also looked into past incidents involving cargo vessels in extreme weather. While several lash carriers had experienced cargo issues, none led to total loss. The Munchen's cargo securing system had a good safety record, suggesting that if cargo shift played a role, it must have been triggered by something extraordinary. A fourth theory examined flooding resulting from structural damage. If the Munchen struck a rogue wave or sustained extreme weather, rapid flooding could sink her before the crew could respond. While modern cargo ships have watertight compartments to handle flooding, damage to multiple areas at once could overcome safety systems. Evidence for flooding came from distress calls received before the ship's disappearance. Some operators reported references to water ingress and damage control efforts. If the crew struggled with flooding during extreme weather, they might have been unable to abandon ship when the situation became dire. Maritime investigators employed advanced techniques to map the seabed at the Munchen's last known location. Using side-scan sonar and deep-sea cameras, they searched for the wreck, but the extreme depth of over 4,000 meters made it difficult to find. In the end, the German Federal Maritime Court concluded that the MS Munchen was lost due to extraordinary weather conditions that led to structural failure. The court cleared the crew of responsibility, noting they followed proper procedures and faced a storm far beyond expectations. MV Salem, 1980. Human voices travel across water in mysterious ways. In the vast emptiness of the world's oceans, where ships can vanish without a trace beneath miles of dark water, sometimes all that remains are the words of those who were there. Crew members of passing vessels, radio operators who heard the final transmissions, and families who waited for news that never came. January 1980. The MV Salem, a cargo vessel carrying 35 souls, disappeared somewhere in the South Atlantic during a severe winter storm. What makes this disappearance particularly haunting is not just the complete absence of wreckage or survivors, but the collection of witness accounts that emerged in the following weeks, testimonies from people who may have been among the last to encounter the doomed vessel. The first witness was radio officer Thomas Kellerman aboard the Norwegian freighter Stavanger Hope. On January 14, 1980, Kellerman was monitoring international distress frequencies when he picked up faint radio transmissions that he later described as desperate and garbled. 3 weeks after the Salem's disappearance, Kellerman told maritime investigators that he heard what sounded like a ship in distress calling for immediate assistance. Though the voice was distorted by static, he distinctly heard the words "taking on water" and "engine room flooding" before the transmission abruptly cut off. The signal was weak, like it was coming from far away, Kellerman told the inquiry board. I tried to respond, but there was no reply. Then everything went quiet. I logged the incident, but we couldn't find our exact position relative to the source due to storm interference. Captain Henrik Larsen of the Stavanger Hope added that his vessel had been battling severe weather in the South Atlantic when Kellerman reported the distress transmission. The storm was unlike anything I had seen in 30 years at sea, Larsen said. Waves over 20 meters high, winds near hurricane force. Visibility was near zero, and our radar was affected by the weather. If there was a ship in distress nearby, we couldn't have helped, even if we knew its location. The second witness was Chief Engineer Roberto Silva of the Brazilian cargo vessel Esperança do Mar. Silva's ship had left Santos 3 days before the Salem's disappearance, bound for Cape Town with coffee and raw materials. Silva said they encountered a ship that might have been the Salem about 200 nautical miles southeast of Rio de Janeiro. We passed another cargo vessel around noon on January 13th, Silva said through an interpreter. The ship was struggling, rolling badly in the seas. I could see through binoculars that she was riding low in the water, as if heavily loaded. My captain considered asking if they needed help, but the weather was getting worse, and we had our own safety to think about. Silver's account was important because his description matched the Salem. She was a mid-sized cargo ship, maybe 120 metres long, with one funnel and 2 cargo cranes. She seemed to be keeping course and speed, but her movement suggested she might have been taking on water or had cargo shift problems. The most disturbing testimony came from Maria Santos, a radio operator at the Brazilian coastal station at Salvador. On January 14th, Santos heard what she called the most unsettling radio transmission of her career. 2 months after the incident, Santos said she received a weak distress signal that she couldn't trace or respond to effectively. The voice was very faint, almost whispered, Santos said. The man sounded tired, maybe scared. He spoke English with what I thought was a British or South African accent. He said something like, "This is cargo vessel Salem. We're abandoning ship, God help us." Then there was silence, and I heard rushing water or howling wind. Then the transmission ended. Santos tried to contact the ship but got no response. Atmospheric conditions and the weak signal made it impossible to find the source. I stayed at the radio for 6 hours, calling for Salem, but heard nothing more. It was very disturbing because the man sounded so hopeless, like he knew he was going to die. 4th Engineer James Mackenzie of the British merchant vessel Cardigan Bay provided the most detailed account of what might have been the Salem's final hours. Early on January 15th, his ship found debris from a recent shipwreck. His testimony gave details about where the Salem might have sunk. Around 0300 hours, the lookout spotted objects in the water, Mackenzie said. Captain ordered engines stopped so we could investigate. We found pieces of timber, what looked like life ring fragments, and several empty oil drums. Some of the wood had fresh break marks suggesting recent destruction. The debris was scattered over about half a mile. Mackenzie also noted something significant. Among the debris, we found a ship's nameplate that had been partially torn away. Only part of the name was visible, but it appeared to read SAM or something similar. The metal was fresh, not corroded like you would expect from a wreck that had been in the water for a long time. The Cardigan Bay crew collected some debris for examination, but storms made recovering larger items impossible. We wanted to search the area more, but weather conditions were worsening, Mackenzie said. The safety of our vessel had to come first. Crew member David Williams added that the life ring fragments looked as if they had been torn apart rather than damaged by age. It was as if they had been ripped from their mountings by tremendous force, possibly by a ship breaking apart in heavy seas, Williams said. Margaret Thompson, whose husband Robert was the Salem's chief engineer, gave emotional testimony about her husband's concerns about the ship's condition. Robert had written to me about problems with the ship's pumping systems and worries about cargo loading, she said. He said the ship seemed to be riding lower than usual, and they were using the pumps more often. Thompson said her husband had reservations about the Salem's seaworthiness in his final letter. He wrote that several crew members were worried about the ship's stability, particularly in heavy weather. Robert had 30 years of experience and didn't worry easily. If he was concerned, something was definitely wrong. Chief Radio Officer William Fletcher of the South African Weather Service provided technical testimony about the atmospheric conditions affecting radio communications during the Salem's disappearance. Fletcher said that the storm created unusual conditions that could explain the fragmented distress transmissions. The storm was generating lots of electromagnetic interference, Fletcher said. Radio signals that would normally carry hundreds of miles were being blocked or distorted. Ships could be in serious distress and unable to communicate effectively. This may explain why the Salem's final transmissions were so weak. Fletcher's analysis suggested that the Salem might have been trying to send distress signals for hours, but the messages were not getting through. In such conditions, a crew might think they were transmitting clearly when their signals were being scattered by the storm. This could create a false sense that help was coming when no one was actually receiving their calls. Able seaman Jose Martinez from the Spanish fishing vessel Galicia saw an unusual oil slick about 300 miles southeast of the Brazilian coast. The oil was very fresh, still rainbow-coloured, Martinez said. It covered about 2 or 3 square kilometres. Our captain thought it might be from a ship that had recently gone down, because older oil spills spread thinner and lose their colour. We reported the location, but the weather was too dangerous for any search operations. Martinez also saw what looked like personal items floating in the oil. There were pieces of clothing, maybe some life jackets, and wooden furniture. Everything was being scattered by the storm, so we couldn't recover anything, but it looked like debris from a ship that had sunk within the previous day or two. Captain Michael Brennan, who led the search for the Salem, highlighted the challenges of search and rescue in the South Atlantic during that winter storm. By the time we reached the search area, any surface debris would have been scattered across thousands of square miles, Brennan said. The storm had been moving northeast, meaning debris could be anywhere within a large area by the time we arrived. The voices and observations of these witnesses paint a haunting picture of the MV Salem's final hours. Though the exact details of her sinking remain a mystery, their words serve as a chilling reminder of the power of the sea and the fragility of human life against its might. SS Valencia, 1906. July 15th, 1933. The morning air over Berkeley Sound was thick with mist when fisherman William Thompson saw something that chilled him to the bone. Drifting in the calm water near Vancouver Island was a lifeboat. Nothing unusual, except this one had the faded markings Valencia number 5 inches painted on it. Thompson rubbed his eyes in disbelief. The SS Valencia had sunk 27 years before, in January 1906, taking 136 people to their deaths in one of the Pacific Northwest's worst disasters. Yet here was her lifeboat, floating calmly as if it had just been launched yesterday. When Thompson got closer, he saw the boat was in amazing shape. The oars were still in place. The emergency supplies remained where they should be. Most unsettling of all, there were no human remains inside. No skeletons, no clothes, and no trace of the passengers or crew who might have used this boat in the Valencia's final hours. The lifeboat seemed untouched by time. This discovery was just the beginning of the Valencia mystery. 6 months after the disaster, a Nucha North fisherman named Clanoa Tom reported finding another Valencia lifeboat in a hidden sea cave. This boat held 8 skeletons still sitting where they had been rowing. Local fishermen began to see phantom lifeboats. They told stories of skeletal figures endlessly rowing along the dangerous coast where the passenger steamer had met its end. These ghost ships would appear in the fog and vanish when approached, as if the dead were still trying to reach the shore. To understand how the Valencia became a source of ghost stories, we need to go back to January 20th, 1906, and Meigs Wharf in San Francisco. It was a clear, calm morning as the 279-foot, iron-hulled passenger steamer prepared for a routine coastal trip. The Valencia was a veteran of Pacific routes. She had carried passengers between South America and New York for over a decade before moving to the Pacific Coast Steamship Company. Captain Oscar Johnson commanded a crew of 65 experienced officers and sailors. The passenger list showed 108 people, men, women and children heading north for business and family visits in Victoria and Seattle. There were 17 women and 11 children. The ship had 6 lifeboats, 2 wooden and 4 metal, along with rafts and a small workboat. This was more than enough space for everyone, according to the rules of the time. At 11:20 a.m, the Valencia set sail north. Captain Johnson followed the standard coastal route, staying close to shore during the day, then moving further out at night to avoid the rocks and reefs that made the Pacific Northwest coast so treacherous. The first day went well, but as the Valencia neared the dangerous waters off Cape Mendocino, the weather changed. Fog rolled in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Captain Johnson slowed down and ordered extra lookouts, following the usual procedures for navigating in bad weather. However, he couldn't have known that the fog would last for the next 2 days, creating problems for even the most experienced navigator. By January 22nd, the Valencia had been sailing blind in thick fog for over 30 hours. Captain Johnson was relying on dead reckoning, estimating the ship's position using the compass, speed, and time. Without seeing landmarks or knowing their location, even small mistakes could lead to trouble. Strong currents and unexpected wind shifts were pushing the ship off course, but Johnson had no way of knowing how far east the Valencia had drifted. Around midnight on January 22nd, lookouts heard the sound of waves breaking ahead. Johnson immediately ordered the engines stopped and began taking soundings to check the water depth. The readings showed they were in shallow water, but the fog was too thick to see the shore. Johnson ordered the ship to back away from the surf, but it was too late. At 11:50 p.m, the SS Valencia hit a reef near Baychimo Point on Vancouver Island's west coast. The impact was devastating. The iron hull was ripped open, and water rushed into the passenger areas and cargo holds. The Valencia had drifted more than 60 miles off course, ending up in one of the most dangerous areas on the coast. Captain Jansen ordered the engines to full astern, but the ship was held fast by the jagged rocks. The Valencia began to lean heavily to port as water flooded the lower decks. Jansen sounded the general alarm and ordered everyone to gather on deck for the emergency evacuation. What happened next became one of the most tragic examples of how a normal trip could become a nightmare. The first attempts to launch lifeboats met with disaster. The rough seas and rocky shore made it impossible to safely deploy the boats. Lifeboat number 1 was launched but was immediately swamped by waves, drowning everyone inside. Lifeboat number 2 met the same fate, crashing against the rocks before its occupants could reach safety. The metal lifeboats were too heavy for the conditions, while the wooden boats were too fragile. Throughout the night of January 22nd and into the morning of January 23rd, the Valencia's situation grew worse. The ship was breaking apart on the rocks. Giant waves were sweeping passengers and crew overboard. The few who reached shore were trapped at the bottom of 100-foot cliffs with no way to climb to safety. Rescue ships couldn't get close enough to help because of the reef and the violent seas. By dawn on January 23rd, only about half of the original 173 people were still alive. The ship's stern had broken off and sunk, taking dozens with it. The remaining part of the vessel, where the bridge and front passenger areas were, was still stuck on the reef but being pounded by waves. Captain Jansen and his crew continued to save lives. The final tragedy occurred on the morning of January 24th. The last part of the Valencia finally broke apart and sank, taking Captain Jansen and most of the remaining passengers and crew with it. Of the 173 people who had left San Francisco 4 days earlier, only 37 survived. All men who had managed to reach the shore. Every woman and child on the Valencia died. The rescue efforts revealed the full horror of what had happened. Bodies washed ashore for weeks. Many were women and children who had been trapped in the ship. The local Nulth people, who knew these waters, helped to recover bodies and assist the few survivors. It was during these efforts that the first mysterious lifeboat discoveries began. What made the Valencia disaster so haunting was how the ship's lifeboats kept appearing long after the sinking. Aside from Klanawa Tom's discovery, other lifeboats were found over the years. Some held human remains, while others were mysteriously empty. All appeared to be in much better condition than they should have been after months or years in the ocean. The 1933 discovery of lifeboat number 5, 27 years after the disaster, became the most famous of these mysterious finds. The boat was not only intact, but showed no signs of the wear that would be expected after almost 3 decades at sea. Maritime experts couldn't explain its pristine condition. Local fishermen started seeing phantom lifeboats. These ghost boats were usually seen during foggy conditions, like those that caused the wreck. Witnesses described boats rowed by skeletons, always heading towards the shore but never arriving. When approached, the phantom boats would vanish into the fog, only to reappear somewhere else. The supernatural legends were reinforced by the discovery of human remains in various locations decades after the sinking. Hikers and beachcombers found bones in coves and sea caves. Maritime archaeologists who have studied the Valencia wreck report unusual findings, adding to the mystery. The main wreck shows signs of having been disturbed in ways that cannot be explained by normal tides or weather. Lyubov Orlova, 2013. In 1976, the Yugoslav shipyard at Kraljevica launched what would become one of the most capable expedition cruise ships of its era. Named after Lyubov Orlova, a celebrated Soviet film actress of the 1930s, the vessel represented the pinnacle of ice-strengthened cruise ship design. At 328 feet long and displacing over 4,000 tons, she was built specifically for the challenging waters of the Arctic and Antarctic, with reinforced steel plating and a hull designed to push through pack ice that would crush ordinary ships. For over 3 decades, the Lyubov Orlova served passengers seeking adventures in the world's most remote and dangerous waters, earning a reputation as one of the most reliable expedition vessels in polar tourism. The ship's early years established her credentials as a premier polar expedition vessel. Operating initially under the Soviet flag, she conducted regular voyages to the Arctic regions, carrying scientists, researchers, and adventure tourists to destinations that few ships could safely reach. Her ice-strengthened hull and powerful engines allowed her to navigate through frozen seas that would trap lesser vessels. The ship's accommodation for 122 passengers in comfortable cabins, combined with lecture halls and observation decks designed for wildlife viewing, made her ideally suited for the growing market in expedition cruising. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Lyubov Orlova built an impressive operational record. She conducted dozens of successful expeditions to Svalbard, Greenland, and the Canadian Arctic, navigating through ice fields and extreme weather conditions that tested both ship and crew. Her passenger manifests included explorers, scientists, photographers, and wealthy adventure seekers willing to pay premium prices for access to some of Earth's most pristine and isolated regions. The ship's reputation for safety and reliability made her a preferred choice for expedition companies organizing polar cruises. In 1999, the vessel was chartered by Marine Expeditions for Antarctic Peninsula cruises, undergoing extensive renovations to prepare her for Southern Ocean operations. The refit included upgraded accommodations, modern navigation equipment, and enhanced safety systems required for operating in Antarctic waters. Under her new charter, the Lyubov Orlova began conducting regular voyages from Argentina to the Antarctic Peninsula, carrying passengers eager to experience the pristine wilderness of the world's southernmost continent. The Antarctic operations represented the height of the Lyubov Orlova's career. She navigated the treacherous Drake Passage, landed passengers on remote beaches populated by penguins and seals, and pushed through ice fields to reach locations that existed only in the dreams of most travelers. Her experienced crews, many of whom had worked aboard the vessel for years, developed an intimate knowledge of polar conditions that made the ship one of the safest options for Antarctic expedition cruising. However, the global financial crisis of 2008 began to impact the luxury travel market that sustained expedition cruising. Passenger bookings declined as economic uncertainty made expensive polar voyages less attractive to potential customers. The Lyubov Orlova's operating company, Marine Expeditions, began experiencing financial difficulties that would eventually lead to the company's collapse and the ship's abandonment. By 2010, the Lyubov Orlova's regular service had ended. The vessel was laid up in St. John's, Newfoundland, while legal disputes over unpaid bills and crew wages played out in Canadian courts. What had once been a proud expedition ship serving adventurous passengers became a deteriorating hulk tied to a dock, accumulating harbour fees and legal claims that exceeded her market value. The transformation from active cruise ship to derelict vessel happened with shocking speed. For 2 years, the Lyubov Orlova remained tied to the dock in St. John's Harbour, slowly deteriorating as maritime lawyers argued over her fate. The ship's condition declined rapidly without proper maintenance. Interior fittings were stripped by creditors, mechanical systems failed, and the vessel began taking on the appearance of a floating ruin. Local authorities grew concerned about the environmental hazard posed by the abandoned ship, particularly the risk of fuel spills or structural collapse. The decision to have the ship towed to the Dominican Republic for scrapping in January 2013 seemed like the end of the Lyubov Orlova's story. After accumulating over $300,000 in harbour fees and facing multiple legal claims, the vessel was finally being removed from Canadian waters to be broken up for scrap metal. The towing operation, contracted to Neptune Marine Services, was intended to be a routine delivery of a derelict vessel to a shipbreaking facility. But on January 24, 2013, just 1 day after leaving St. John's Harbour, the impossible happened. The tow line connecting the Lyubov Orlova to her tug snapped in rough seas approximately 1,300 nautical miles southeast of Newfoundland. The abandoned cruise ship, now carrying only rats and deteriorating equipment, broke free and began drifting into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. What should have been the final chapter of the vessel's career became the beginning of one of the most bizarre maritime mysteries of the 21st century. The Canadian Coast Guard initially attempted to recapture the drifting vessel, but rough weather conditions and the ship's location in international waters complicated recovery efforts. A second tug, the Atlantic Hawk, managed to reconnect with the Lyubov Orlova on January 30th and began towing her further east, away from Canadian territorial waters and shipping lanes. However, this second tow line also failed on February 4th, and the ship once again broke free, this time drifting into the open Atlantic beyond any immediate recovery attempts. Within hours of the second towline failure, the Lyubov Orlova had transformed from a routine maritime salvage operation into an international media sensation. News outlets around the world began reporting on the ghost ship drifting unmanned through the North Atlantic. The story captured public imagination partly due to its inherent drama, an abandoned cruise ship roaming the seas like a maritime Flying Dutchman, but also because of one particularly unsettling detail discovered during the ship's abandonment. The vessel was reportedly infested with hundreds of rats that had taken up residence during her 2 years moored in St. John's Harbour. With no human crew aboard and limited food sources, maritime experts speculated that the rat population would be forced into cannibalism to survive. The image of a ghost ship crewed only by starving, cannibalistic rodents proved irresistible to media outlets seeking dramatic headlines. The cannibal rat ship became a global news phenomenon, spawning thousands of articles, social media posts, and conspiracy theories. The Lyubov Orlova's transformation into a media sensation represented something entirely new in maritime history. Previous ghost ships had become famous through folklore and legend, often decades or centuries after their disappearance. But the Lyubov Orlova became infamous in real time, with satellite tracking, social media coverage, and international news reports documenting her drift across the North Atlantic. The ship's journey was followed by millions of people worldwide, turning her into the first celebrity ghost ship of the internet age. Maritime authorities faced unprecedented challenges in dealing with the drifting vessel. The Lyubov Orlova was too large and dangerous to ignore, but too far from shore and too expensive to recover. Her drift path, influenced by ocean currents and prevailing winds, was tracked by multiple nations as she moved slowly eastward across the Atlantic. Computer models suggested she might eventually approach European waters, raising concerns about collision risks with commercial shipping or potential grounding on inhabited coastlines. The international legal complications surrounding the drifting ship added another dimension to her notoriety. Questions arose about who was responsible for the vessel's recovery, who would bear the costs if she caused damage, and what authority had jurisdiction over a stateless ship in international waters. The Lyubov Orlova had become a maritime legal nightmare, drifting through a complex web of international treaties and national regulations that had never anticipated such a scenario. Emergency locator beacons aboard the ship began transmitting in March 2013, suggesting that the vessel had either broken apart or was taking on water. However, no wreckage was ever definitively recovered, and the signals could not be precisely located due to their brief transmission duration. The possibility that the ship had finally sunk brought some relief to maritime authorities, but also frustrated the millions of people who had been following her journey and hoping for a more definitive conclusion to the story. The cannibal rat narrative that surrounded the ship's final voyage also reflected humanity's enduring fascination with maritime mysteries and ghost ship legends. Despite living in an age of satellite tracking and instant global communication, the public remained captivated by the idea of a ship sailing empty across the ocean. The Lyubov Orlova proved that even in the 21st century, the sea could still produce stories that captured imaginations and generated modern folklore. Environmental groups seized upon the Lyubov Orlova story to highlight the growing problem of abandoned vessels worldwide. The ship became a case study in the environmental and economic costs of maritime abandonment, demonstrating how quickly a valuable asset could become a dangerous liability. Her story prompted discussions about better regulations for ship disposal and more robust financial guarantees to prevent similar incidents. SS Poet, 1980. October 24, 1980. The cargo ship SS Poet left Philadelphia with 13,500 tons of corn for Egypt and 34 experienced crew members. 3 days later, the ship was gone, without a single distress signal or any trace of wreckage. No bodies, no lifeboats, no debris, nothing. The disappearance of the SS Poet became one of the most investigated maritime mysteries, leading to theories from natural disasters to Cold War espionage. The United States Coast Guard started an investigation that would last for years and involve many federal agencies. The first focus was on the ship's condition and the crew. The SS Poet was a 522-foot Liberty ship built in 1944 during World War II and later changed for cargo. At 36 years old, she was old for a ship, but Inspection showed she was seaworthy with valid safety certificates. Captain Edgar Stevens, with over 30 years of experience, commanded the vessel. His crew included seasoned officers and able seamen familiar with Atlantic crossings. The ship had modern navigation and communication equipment, including radios that should have allowed distress calls to be sent across thousands of miles. The weather at the time of departure was good, with no major storms expected along the route to Port Said. The Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation looked at every part of the voyage, starting with the ship's loading in Philadelphia. The corn cargo, part of the US government's Food for Peace program, had been properly loaded and secured. The ship's weight and stability were normal. There was nothing in the departure that suggested any problems. Search operations began immediately when the Poet failed to make scheduled radio contact. Coast Guard aircraft and vessels searched over 300,000 square nautical miles of ocean along the ship's route. Merchant vessels were asked to report any wreckage. Satellite images were checked for signs of the missing ship. Despite this, no evidence was found to explain what had happened. The first theory was catastrophic structural failure. The ship's age raised questions about whether hidden weaknesses might have caused the hull to fail in heavy seas. Liberty ships were known to suffer from metal fatigue, and some had cracked during their service. If the Poet had encountered unexpected severe weather, this could explain her quick disappearance without a distress call. However, weather records showed calm conditions along the Poet's route. Ocean buoys and satellite data showed wave heights of only 8 to 12 feet, rough for small boats but not a large cargo ship. Even if structural failure had occurred, some debris should have remained on the surface. A second theory focused on fire or explosion. Grain cargoes like corn can create explosive dust, and electrical failures might have triggered explosions. Previous incidents showed how quickly such explosions could destroy a vessel. If the Poet had suffered a grain dust explosion, the fire and damage might have caused her to sink quickly. The explosion theory gained some support from the Coast Guard's investigation of the cargo loading. Inspectors found that dust control procedures had not been followed during loading in Philadelphia. Grain dust levels in the ship's holds might have reached dangerous levels, creating a potential explosion. However, grain carriers had ventilation systems to prevent this, and the Poet's systems had been recently inspected. As the investigation continued without clear evidence, more unusual theories emerged. One theory suggested the SS Poet had been seized by North Korean naval forces. The ship was taken to a North Korean port, the crew imprisoned, and the vessel used by the communist regime. This theory drew support from intelligence reports about North Korean naval activity in the Atlantic during 1980. The USS Pueblo incident of 1968 showed that such operations were possible. Proponents argued that the Poet's cargo and crew would have made her a good target for a regime facing food shortages and transport needs. However, experts doubted this theory. Seizing a ship thousands of miles from North Korean bases seemed unlikely. The Poet was a large, slow-moving ship that would have been hard to hide or transport covertly. Intelligence agencies found no evidence of increased submarine activity needed for such an operation. A conspiracy theory connected the Poet's disappearance to the Iran-Contra affair. CIA operatives had seized the ship and diverted her cargo to support covert operations in Central America. The corn would have fed Contra rebels, and the ship could have transported weapons without oversight. This theory gained attention when investigators found ships used for covert operations. It suggested the Poet's disappearance had been planned to hide intelligence operations. If the ship was lost at sea, using it for illegal arms shipments would be impossible to trace. Congressional investigators examined this theory, but found no evidence linking the Poet to covert operations. The timing was wrong. The ship disappeared in October 1980, while most Iran-Contra activities occurred later. CIA officials denied involvement, and no documents suggested intelligence agency interest in the ship or cargo. A fourth theory involved organised crime. Mobsters had seized the Poet to steal her corn cargo, which could be resold on international markets. Criminal organisations with connections to Middle Eastern markets had arranged the hijacking. This theory gained support from FBI investigations into dock worker corruption and criminal influence over maritime shipping. Several ports, including Philadelphia, had organised crime presence. Criminals had been involved in cargo theft and insurance fraud. The absence of wreckage could be explained if the ship had been taken to a remote location, stripped and scuttled. However, law enforcement found no evidence of organised crime involvement. Surveillance of known criminals revealed no unusual activities. Hijacking a cargo ship and disposing of it without any trace seemed beyond the capabilities of even sophisticated criminal organisations. Maritime insurance investigators developed theories based on the ship's finances. The insurance coverage exceeded $10 million, which might have motivated insurance fraud. The ship's owners might have arranged for its destruction to collect insurance while secretly preserving the cargo for resale. The insurance fraud theory was investigated by Lloyd's of London. Financial audits revealed no unusual transactions. The owners cooperated fully and provided documentation. No evidence supported deliberate destruction for financial gain. Advanced oceanographic analysis was conducted to see if unknown natural events might have contributed to the disappearance. Scientists studied ocean currents, underwater features, and weather data to identify unusual conditions. Some theorized about rogue waves or underwater landslides. The investigation revealed the poet had been traveling in an area known for complex currents and severe weather. Computer models suggested rapid weather changes could have generated larger waves than detected. However, even extreme events should have left some debris. Satellite technology became important as investigators tried to understand the ship's final hours. Early weather satellites had limited capabilities, but the images were examined. Military surveillance assets were also consulted. The satellite analysis confirmed no major weather disturbances had occurred. The disappearance of the SS Poet remains a mystery. Despite years of investigation, no clear explanation has emerged. The ship vanished without a trace, leaving behind only theories and questions. The fate of the poet and her crew remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the sea. Octavius, 1775. The ice stretched endlessly in every direction. A white wasteland broken only by jagged pressure ridges and the occasional lead of dark water. October 11th, 1775. Captain Warren of the whaling vessel Herald was navigating the treacherous waters west of Greenland when his lookout spotted something that defied explanation. Locked in the Arctic ice, her sails still partially set but covered in frost, was a three-masted schooner that appeared to have been abandoned. The ship sat perfectly upright, trapped in ice so thick it seemed she would never break free. Warren ordered his crew to investigate what they assumed would be another derelict vessel claimed by the brutal Arctic conditions. What they found aboard that frozen ship would become one of maritime history's most chilling tales, though one that historians today question as legend rather than fact. The vessel bore the name Octavius painted across her stern. Her decks were covered in snow and ice, but the ship's structure appeared remarkably intact. It was when Warren and his men descended below decks that they made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the captain's cabin, seated at a wooden table with a pen still frozen in his hand, was the body of a man. The extreme cold had preserved him perfectly, as if he'd simply fallen asleep while writing in the ship's log. Around the table sat other figures, crew members who had apparently gathered for a final meeting before the cold claimed them. Throughout the ship, Warren's men found the entire crew of 28 souls, all frozen in the positions where death had found them. Some were in their bunks, others at their posts, all preserved by the Arctic conditions, like figures in a macabre wax museum. According to the legend recorded by Warren, the captain's logbook told an impossible story. The final entries, written in a hand growing increasingly shaky from cold and desperation, were dated November 11th, 1762, 13 years before the Herald's discovery. The logs described the Octavius's attempt to navigate the fabled Northwest Passage, that elusive Arctic route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that had claimed so many ships and lives. The captain had written of his crew becoming trapped in ice, of temperatures so severe that fires could barely be maintained, and of the gradual realization that they would never escape their frozen prison. Warren reportedly took only the logbook before fleeing the ghostly vessel, too disturbed by the scene to remain aboard any longer. He left the Octavius and her frozen crew locked in their icy tomb, where they presumably remain to this day, drifting eternally through the Arctic seas. The story, as Warren later told it, suggested that the Octavius had achieved what so many expeditions had failed to accomplish, successfully navigating the Northwest Passage, but had paid the ultimate price for this historic achievement. But to understand how the Octavius came to be trapped in that eternal Arctic prison, we must travel back to 1761 and the bustling port of London. According to the legend, the three-masted schooner departed London in that year, bound for China with a cargo of trade goods. This was the era of expanding global commerce, when European merchants were establishing lucrative trading relationships with distant Asian markets. The Octavius was reportedly one of many vessels carrying manufactured goods eastward, and returning with silk, spices and other exotic products that commanded high prices in European markets. The ship successfully completed her voyage to China, loading a valuable cargo for the return journey to London. But it was here that the captain made a fateful decision that would doom his vessel and crew. Instead of returning by the safe but lengthy route around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, he decided to attempt the Northwest Passage, the legendary shortcut through the Arctic that would reduce the journey by thousands of miles. If successful, the time saved would mean enormous profits and potential fame for discovering a practical northern route to Asia. The decision to attempt the Northwest Passage in the 1760s was extraordinarily dangerous. The Arctic was largely unmapped, and the few expeditions that had ventured into those waters had either returned defeated by ice or disappeared entirely. The Octavius was not specifically equipped for Arctic navigation. She lacked the reinforced hull and specialized equipment that would be necessary for pushing through ice fields. The captain was essentially gambling his ship, crew and cargo on the hope that favorable conditions might allow passage through one of the world's most hostile maritime environments. The voyage began promisingly enough. The Octavius entered Arctic waters during the brief summer season when ice coverage was at its minimum. For several weeks, the ship made good progress through leads and channels in the ice pack. The crew must have felt optimistic as they sailed through waters no merchant vessel had ever successfully navigated. They were on the verge of achieving one of the greatest maritime accomplishments of their era, opening a practical trade route to Asia through the Arctic. But the Arctic summer is brief and unpredictable. As autumn approached, temperatures began dropping and ice began forming with frightening speed. The channels that had allowed the Octavius to penetrate deep into the Arctic archipelago began closing behind them. New ice formed daily, and existing ice floes grew thicker and more impenetrable. The ship found herself trapped in an ever-tightening grip of ice that would prove impossible to escape. According to the logbook entries Warren claimed to have read, the crew initially maintained hope that spring thaws would free their vessel. They conserved food and fuel, organised regular watches, and attempted to maintain normal shipboard routines, despite their increasingly desperate situation. The captain recorded their position as accurately as possible and documented their attempts to break free from the ice using saws, chisels, and even explosives to create channels. As winter deepened and supplies dwindled, the situation aboard the Octavius became increasingly grim. The ship's heating systems proved inadequate for Arctic conditions, and crew members began suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. The logbook allegedly described men dying one by one from cold and starvation, their bodies perfectly preserved by the frigid conditions. Food supplies, calculated for a normal voyage to China, were exhausted months before any possibility of rescue could arrive. The captain's final entries supposedly described the crew's last desperate hours. With no fuel remaining for heating, the interior of the ship became as cold as the Arctic air outside. The men gathered in the captain's cabin, perhaps for warmth or simply for companionship in their final moments. The captain continued writing until the pen froze in his hand, documenting the end of his ship and crew with the dedication of a professional mariner recording his observations until the very end. For 13 years, according to the legend, the Octavius drifted through the Arctic ice pack with her cargo of Chinese goods and her crew of frozen corpses. Ocean currents and shifting ice eventually carried the ship eastward, completing the Northwest Passage journey in death that had been impossible to achieve in life. The vessel became a ghost ship in the most literal sense, a tomb drifting through Arctic waters with its crew preserved exactly as they had died. MV Arctic Sea, 2009. In the summer of 2009, the world was puzzled by the disappearance of the MV Arctic Sea, a cargo ship carrying timber in the Baltic Sea. This event sparked an international search involving navies and intelligence agencies and led to many conspiracy theories. Was it piracy, a cover-up for illegal weapons, or something more? On July 21, 2009, the Arctic Sea left Pietarsaari, Finland, with Captain Sergei Zaretsky and a crew of 15 Russians. The ship carried 6,500 cubic meters of finished timber with about £1 million, headed for Bajaya, Algeria. It was a normal shipment, just timber for construction. The Arctic Sea was a typical ship for the Baltic Sea, built in 1991 for cargo trips. It had a shallow draft for smaller ports and efficient engines. Though it flew a Maltese flag, its crew and ownership showed the global nature of shipping. For 3 days, the trip was normal. The ship went through the Baltic Sea, passing Sweden. The crew kept in contact with offices in Finland and Russia, giving updates. The weather was good, and they were on time. But on July 24th, off the coast of Sweden, something happened. According to Russia, men in a small boat said they had engine problems. Captain Zaretsky, as was custom, let them approach. The men, armed, boarded the Arctic Sea, took control, and forced the captain to change course, away from Algeria. This began a 3-week disappearance that confused authorities and created many theories. The first sign of trouble was on July 28th, when the ship's company in Finland lost contact. The ship didn't report its position, and calls to the captain went unanswered. At first, it wasn't a big worry, as communication problems happen. But as time passed, concern grew. Swedish authorities were told on July 30th when the ship didn't check in near the English Channel. It should have been near the Dover Strait, but it wasn't on radar. Even worse, the ship's tracking system was off. It was rare for a cargo ship to vanish in busy shipping lanes. The investigation began, but it was clear this wasn't a normal case. The ship was last seen on radar on July 24th, the same day as the alleged boarding, but no distress signals were sent and no other ships reported anything unusual. A large search began in the North Sea, English Channel and Atlantic Ocean. Coast Guard ships and aircraft from different countries searched, and satellite images were checked. But the Arctic Sea seemed to have disappeared completely. The first theory was piracy. There had been some cargo theft in the Baltic and North Seas, but nothing like this. Pirates usually target valuable goods, not timber. The reason for stealing timber didn't seem worth the risk. However, this case was different. Most cargo thieves stay close to shore to quickly move goods. Taking a ship and crew hostage for weeks suggested either very skilled criminals or other reasons besides theft. Another theory was that the ship had secret cargo, like illegal weapons for Iran, Syria or other countries under embargo. If true, the hijacking could have been an attempt to stop the shipment. This theory was supported by the ship's route and timing. The ship left Finland during tension over Iran's nuclear program. Intelligence agencies were watching for weapon shipments, and past cases involved ships with both normal goods and hidden weapons. The theory said the hijackers were actually intelligence agents. Supporting the weapons theory was Russia's response. The Russian Navy sent multiple ships to search, which seemed like too much for just timber. Some argued that no government would spend so much to recover lumber unless there was something more valuable. A third theory was that the whole thing was a trick by Russian intelligence. The ship was being used for secret operations, maybe related to arms or intelligence. The hijacking story would hide the ship's real activities. This theory was backed by inconsistent Russian statements. Different agencies gave different accounts of when the hijacking happened, how many attackers were involved, and what they wanted. The lack of coordination suggested either incompetence or a cover-up. On August 17, 2009, the mystery seemed solved when the Russian Navy said they found the Arctic Sea off the coast of Cape Verde. They arrested 8 alleged hijackers and freed the crew. The crew was said to be in good health, though they were guarded for 3 weeks. But the resolution raised questions. The ship was far from its route, in waters that made no sense for timber. The hijackers were from Estonia and Latvia, not typical for pirates. They also made no demands and took no cargo, despite having control for weeks. The hijackers' backgrounds were also strange. They included sailors and former military, not typical cargo thieves. Some had no criminal record and steady jobs, which made their motive unclear. Their background suggested they were following orders, not acting for personal gain. An inspection of the ship found only timber, with no hidden weapons. However, 3 weeks was enough time to remove any secret cargo before the ship was found. The crew's stories were consistent but lacked details. The captain and officers said they were overpowered and guarded while the ship sailed to an unknown place. But none could say where they went or what the hijackers wanted. The similar stories suggested either coaching or memory gaps from trauma. international investigators faced problems. The ship was under Russian control, limiting access. The crime was in international waters, causing legal issues, and the governments involved seemed more interested in controlling information than finding the truth. The hijackers' trial showed that the official story was incomplete. The trials were mostly secret, and defense attorneys were discouraged from investigating certain things. Key evidence was classified for national security. The convictions seemed planned, not based on a fair trial. Analysts saw patterns of false flag operations, which are covert actions meant to hide their true purpose. The Arctic Sea case had many signs of this: deception, conflicting government actions, evidence that didn't support the official story, and scripted testimonies. Other theories suggested the ship was used to test naval techniques, spy on European shipping, or smuggle people or materials. The 3-week disappearance allowed time for these activities, and the hijacking story covered up any unusual behaviour. MV Jansen 2006. March 24, 2006. The helicopter crew from Australian Coast Watch was conducting a routine patrol over the Gulf of Carpentaria when they spotted something that shouldn't have been there. Drifting lazily in the crystal-clear waters 180 kilometres southwest of Waipa, Queensland, was an 80-metre cargo tanker moving with no apparent purpose or destination. The vessel appeared to be intact and seaworthy, but something about her movement through the water seemed wrong. She was wallowing in the gentle swells like a ship without power, without crew, without anyone at the helm to guide her through these remote Australian waters. When the Australian Coast Guard vessel pulled alongside the mysterious tanker 2 hours later, boarding officer Michael Reynolds found himself staring at one of the most unsettling sights of his maritime career. The name Jansen was painted in bold letters across the stern, but that was virtually the only identification visible on the entire vessel. Every other marking that might have indicated the ship's origin, ownership, or registration had been deliberately removed or obscured. Port registration numbers had been scraped off. Flag indicators were missing. Even the manufacturer's plates that normally identified the vessel's construction details had been carefully eliminated. But it was what Reynolds discovered when he boarded the ship that transformed this from a simple case of an abandoned vessel into one of Australia's most baffling maritime mysteries. The cargo holds were empty, but the ship's engine was still running. Fuel tanks were nearly full. Navigation equipment was operational. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the crew quarters, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. Coffee cups sat half empty on galley tables. Bunks were unmade but showed signs of recent occupation. Most chilling of all, the ship's logbook had been completely removed, every page torn out, leaving only the empty binding as evidence that records had once existed. Reynolds counted berthing space for 11 crew members, but the ship was completely deserted. No bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of emergency evacuation. The crew had simply disappeared, leaving behind their clothes, personal photographs, and even money in small amounts. A broken tow rope hung from the bow, suggesting the vessel had been under tow at some point before being abandoned. But who had been towing this ship, and why had they cut her loose in the middle of nowhere? To understand how the Jansen came to be drifting empty through Australian waters, investigators had to work backward from the few clues available aboard the mysterious vessel. The ship appeared to be of Chinese construction, built sometime in the 1980s as a small cargo tanker designed for short-haul operations in coastal waters. Her size and configuration suggested she was intended for transporting liquid cargoes like fuel oil, chemicals, or water between ports that lacked facilities for larger vessels. The presence of Chinese-language documents and personal effects suggested the missing crew had been Chinese nationals. Investigators found crew quarters arranged in typical Chinese merchant marine fashion, with shared berthing areas and a communal galley equipped with cooking implements suited for Chinese cuisine. The ship's library contained books and magazines in Mandarin, and personal photographs showed Asian men in maritime uniforms, presumably the missing crew members. However, determining the ship's recent history proved nearly impossible due to the systematic removal of identifying information. Maritime investigators from the Australian Federal Police and Customs authorities launched an intensive effort to trace the vessel's origins, but every lead dead-ended in bureaucratic obstacles or missing records. The ship did not appear in any official registry of Chinese merchant vessels. No port authority had records of the Jansen entering or departing their facilities. insurance databases contained no policies for a vessel of that name and description. The investigation expanded to examine the ship's physical condition for clues about her recent activities. Maritime surveyors found evidence that the vessel had been operating regularly until very recently. The engine showed signs of proper maintenance, and mechanical systems were in good working order. The galley contained fresh food supplies, suggesting the crew had been aboard within days of the ship's discovery. Fuel levels indicated the vessel had been refueled within the previous month, though no record of such refueling could be found at any legitimate marine fuel facility. More troubling was the discovery of modifications to the ship's cargo handling systems that suggested possible involvement in illegal activities. The vessel's pumping systems had been upgraded with equipment suitable for rapidly transferring liquid cargoes, and extra fuel storage had been added in areas normally used for other purposes. These modifications were consistent with vessels used for fuel smuggling or other illicit trade, though no contraband was found aboard the abandoned ship. The broken tow rope provided the most concrete clue about the Jansen's immediate past. Maritime forensics experts examined the rope and determined it had been severed cleanly, suggesting deliberate cutting rather than accidental failure under load. The rope's condition and the lack of wear on the ship's towing hardware indicated this had been a recent arrangement, possibly within hours of the vessel's discovery. But who had been towing the Jansen, and why had they abandoned her in international waters? Intelligence agencies began investigating whether the vessel might have been involved in people smuggling operations. The ship's size and configuration made her suitable for transporting illegal immigrants, and the remote location where she was found was consistent with routes used by human trafficking networks. However, no evidence of recent passengers was found aboard the vessel, and the crew accommodation suggested a working merchant ship rather than a transport for human cargo. The timing of the discovery raised additional questions about possible connections to regional security concerns. March 2006 was a period of heightened maritime security awareness in Southeast Asia, with multiple nations conducting operations against piracy, terrorism, and illegal fishing. The Jansen's appearance during this period, combined with her suspicious modifications and missing identification, suggested possible involvement in activities that might have attracted official attention. Chinese authorities were contacted through diplomatic channels but provided little assistance in identifying the vessel or her missing crew. Officials claimed no knowledge of a ship named Jansen and suggested the vessel might be using a false identity. This response frustrated Australian investigators, who suspected Chinese authorities knew more about the ship than they were willing to admit. The lack of cooperation from the vessel's apparent country of origin made it nearly impossible to trace her legitimate history. The investigation took an unexpected turn when maritime archaeologists examining the ship's construction details discovered evidence that she might have been built for military rather than civilian use. Certain structural elements and equipment mounting points were consistent with naval auxiliary vessels rather than commercial cargo ships. If true, this suggested the Jansen might have been a decommissioned military vessel converted for civilian use, which could explain the difficulties in tracing her official registration. Environmental testing of the ship's cargo tanks revealed trace amounts of various petroleum products, confirming that the vessel had been used to transport liquid cargoes. However, the mixture of different fuel types suggested irregular or possibly illegal trading patterns, rather than legitimate commercial operations. Some of the fuel residues were consistent with marine diesel that had been diluted or contaminated, suggesting possible involvement in fuel adulteration schemes. The personal effects found aboard provided tantalizing but incomplete glimpses into the lives of the missing crew members. Photographs showed the same group of men in various locations that appeared to be ports throughout Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. The progression of images suggested the crew had been working together for an extended period, possibly several years. But without names or identifying documents, investigators could not determine who these men were or what had happened to them. Advanced forensic techniques were employed to search for additional clues about the crew's fate. DNA sampling from personal items and living spaces revealed genetic material from multiple individuals, confirming that the ship had been occupied by at least 11 people. However, without comparative samples or access to international DNA databases, this information provided no leads about the identity or current whereabouts of the missing crew members. The ship's communication equipment was thoroughly examined for evidence of recent radio traffic, or navigational data that might indicate her recent course and activities. Radio logs had been deliberately erased, but technical specialists were able to recover fragments of data suggesting the vessel had been in contact with other ships and shore stations within the previous week. The communication patterns were consistent with coordinated operations involving multiple vessels, though the specific nature of these operations remained unclear. Satellite imagery analysis was conducted to track the ship's movements in the days before her discovery. Intelligence agencies with access to reconnaissance satellites provided limited assistance, revealing that the Jansen had appeared on radar approximately 400 kilometers northeast of her discovery location, roughly 48 hours earlier. Before that point, the vessel's movements could not be traced, suggesting she had been operating in areas not covered by routine surveillance or had been using techniques to avoid detection. The investigation ultimately revealed a pattern of systematic concealment that suggested the Jansen had been deliberately prepared for abandonment. The removal of identifying marks, the erasure of communication logs, and the elimination of documentary evidence all pointed to a coordinated effort to obscure the vessel's history and activities. This level of planning suggested the abandonment was not the result of emergency or accident, but rather a deliberate decision by people with significant resources and planning capabilities. Insurance fraud investigators examined whether the ship's abandonment might have been motivated by financial considerations. However, the systematic removal of identification made it impossible to determine who owned the vessel or whether any insurance claims had been filed. The absence of any distress signals or reports of crew rescue suggested the abandonment was not intended to trigger insurance payouts, but rather to eliminate evidence of the ship's activities. 21 ships, hundreds of missing people, zero complete explanations. We've seen vessels found with engines running and meals half-eaten, ships discovered decades after they vanished, crews that disappeared without sending a single distress signal. The ocean doesn't give up its ghosts easily.